Gentlemen, distinguished guests, a very good welcome to you all and good afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the APEC Gyeongbuk Knowledge Forum. Please allow me to introduce myself. My name is Jin, and I've been given the honor and privilege of being here as your MC today. Thank you very much for your attendance. Thank you very much. The APEC Gyeongbuk Knowledge Forum, starting now, is a pre-event co-hosted by Gyeongbuk and the World Knowledge Forum to build momentum for a successful APEC summit. Today's forum offers valuable insights into global issues while also showcasing the future competitiveness of Gyeongbuk. It is truly a meaningful opportunity to envision the future of Gyeongbuk together with the world's leading scholars. Today, we're also supported by Polito, an AI interpretation tool, which I hope will make this session even more fruitful and engaging. So then, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let us now begin our first session. Session 1 is APEC 1, Inclusive Growth led by APEC. We are very honored to have Mr. Lee Chul-woo, Governor of Gyeongsangbuk-do, as the moderator for this session. Ladies and gentlemen, please greet him with a big round of applause. Thank you very much. And moving on, we're also very honored to have our distinguished panel speaker, Mr. Justin Trudeau, the 23rd Prime Minister of Canada. Please join me in welcoming him as well. Thank you very much. To begin the session, I would like to kindly invite Governor Lee Chul-woo to deliver his welcoming remarks. Governor Lee, the floor is yours.
예, 반갑습니다. 오늘 매경에서 하는 이 세계지식인 포럼에 며칠 전까지 캐나다 총리를 지낸 트리더 총리께서 참석해 주셔서 정말 감사드리고 이분에 대해서 좀 알아보니까 아버지께서도 총리를 한 15년 하셨더라고요. 그런데 이분도 한 12여 년 총리를 하셨는데 아주 명문 집안입니다, 보니까. 그리고 캐나다를 다양성을 갖는 그런 나라로 만들어 주어서 굉장히 인기 있는 그런 총리 역할을 해왔고, 또 제가 보니까 수학 선생님을 좀 하셨더라고요. 저도 수학 선생님 5년 했는데 저하고 같은 점이 그렇게 있었고, 저는 우리 당 대통령 경선 후보로 나가 떨어졌는데 이분은 벌써 10년이나 해서 저보다도 훨씬 젊은데 오늘 배울 게 많이 있을 거로 생각하고, 오늘 주제는 뭐 여러 가지가 있겠습니다만은 트럼프 대통령의 관세 정책이라든지 미중 패권이라든지 세계적인 현안에 대해서 주로 의논을 나누면은 언론사에서 좋아하겠지만은 저는 그래도 경상북도 도지사이기 때문에 경북이 안고 있는 문제가 우리나라 문제고 또 세계에서 우리보다 어려운 나라들이 겪고 있는 그런 문제들을 포용하는 포용 성장을 주제로 좀 얘기를 나눌까 합니다. 이미 캐나다는 G7에 들은 선진국이고 개인 소득도 5만 3천 분에 되는 이런 큰 나라입니다. 그래서 여러 가지 문제 중에 APEC의 중요성, 포용 성장을 위한 APEC, 또 한국의 APEC의 의미, 또 그리고 우리가 겪고 있는 인구 문제, 또 인구 문제를 해결하기 위해서는 이민 정책에 대해서는 최고 전문가입니다. 또 이민 정책, 또 기후 변화에 따른 원전 문제, SMR 이런 걸 어떻게 할 거냐. 또 캐나다가 얼마 전에 산불이 크게 났었는데 23년도에 우리가 소방단을 보내서 산불을 꺼준 적도 있습니다. 이런 문제에 대해서 기후 변화에 대해서 의견을 나누고, 또 플로어에서 질문이 있으면은 그 얘기를 하도록 하겠습니다. 오늘 이 저스틴 총리께서 매경 지식 포럼에 왔는 김에 에이펙을 개최하는 경북 도지사와 이래 대담을 갖게 돼서 저는 무한한 영광으로 생각하고, 저는 최근에 3개월 전에 암 4기 판단을 받은 사람입니다. 그런데도 지금 이 중요한 자리이기 때문에 와서 있는데, 혹시나 제가 건강에 약간 이상이 있다 싶으면은 뭐 그런 일은 없습니다만은 남들이 다 기적이라 하더라고요. 그래서 지금은 상태가 굉장히 좋은 상태니까 걱정 안 하셔도 되고, 저를 아는 분들이 많이 계셔서 혹시나 걱정하시면 이 말씀을 드렸습니다. 오늘 다시 한번 총리께서 와주신 데 대해서 정말 감사드리고, 대한민국과 캐나다가 같이 갈 일, 또 경상북도가 같이 갈 일에 대해서 먼저 인사말을 좀 듣도록 하겠습니다. 총리께서 인사 좀 해주시기 바랍니다.
I had the opportunity to speak this morning, so I'm not going to speak too much. I'm much more looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have about issues facing your communities and indeed Korea and the world. I will say that it was an extraordinarily important part of my calendar to come to APEC every year, wherever it was around the Pacific. And the conversations that will be had here in the coming months leading up to APEC and at the APEC meeting are incredibly important. APEC came together around trade. It is important that the Korean example of success, what you have been able to build over the past years, is extraordinarily important. And I know it will be an important moment for APEC to be learning directly through Korea's leadership. I will also make a comment because you referred to climate change and the fact that Korean firefighters came to Canada during one of our very difficult wildfire seasons. I actually got the opportunity to go onto the plane as they were flying back home to say thank you personally for the incredible heroic work they did, but also to underline the deep friendship between Canada and Korea and how we are countries that are there for each other. We are different in many ways, and I'm sure as we begin to talk about immigration that will come through how different our countries are in many ways. But there are so many values that we share, so many perspectives that we have on global events, but also so many approaches we share domestically in terms of not just fighting for democracy and defending democracy as you have, but making sure we're building strong, inclusive societies. And I very much look forward to this conversation and am deeply, deeply grateful, as all of us are, that you chose, despite the challenges you're facing personally, to come and lead this important discussion. It is truly a testament to the kind of leader you are, Governor Lee.
예, 감사합니다. AI가 좋긴 좋은데 말씀하는 게 바로 여기 통역이 돼서 나오니까 앞으로 이게 말로도 나올 수 있는 그런 기계를 개발해서 여기 이분이 말씀하신 게 말로 바로 전달되는, 그러면은 이제 영어 공부한다고 애를 안 먹어도 되는 그런 시대가 올 거라고 생각합니다. 산불 때 총리께서 그분들이 우리 경북 소방단이 갔었거든요. 경상북도 소방단이 왜 그 대표로 뽑혔느냐? 우리나라에서 산이 가장 많은 지역이 경북이고, 그러다 보니 산불이 가장 많은 지역이 우리 지역입니다. 그래서 제가 산불을 여러 차례 겪으면서 지금까지 산불은 산림청에서 끄는 거고 우리 소방은 집에서 나는 불들을 끄는 거다, 이래 돼가 있었는데, 제가 가서 불 끄는 거는 소방이 해야 되는 거 아니냐, 산불 대응 특별팀을 만들었습니다. 밤에 산에 올라가서 불을 끌 수 있는 팀을 만드니까 산불을 누구보다도 잘 끌 수 있는 훈련이 돼가 있었습니다. 그래서 한국 대표로 23년도 캐나다가 그때 1,500만 헥타를 태웠더라고요. 그 우리나라 전체가 1,000만 헥타입니다. 우리나라 1.5배를 태운 겁니다. 그때 우리 소방단이 갔는데 총리께서 직접 그 사람들 돌아오는데 비행기까지 와서 인사를 해줬습니다. 그래서 굉장히 감동을 받았는데, 다시 한번 감사하다는 박수를 한번 보내주시기 바랍니다. 이 기후 변화 때문에 지금 폭염, 폭우, 북극해가 녹아난다 이런 문제가 생기는데 캐나다도 산불이 많이 나지만 호주에도 산불이 나고 미국에도 산불이 많이 나고 또 갑자기 폭우가 쏟아져서 육지가 다 물에 잠기는 이런 일들이 벌어지는 이 기후 변화거든요. 그 기후 변화에 대응하기 위해서 지금 재생에너지라든지 이런 대책을 하고 있고 만약에 재생에너지를 쓰지 않으면 수출도 못하는 이런 나라가 되는데 우리나라 형편에 태양광이나 풍력 발전으로 다 메우기는 굉장히 힘들기 때문에 저 경상북도에 원전을 많이 가지고 있습니다. 그래서 원전으로서 대책을 강구해야 된다고 생각하고 있는데 지난 정부까지는 원전을 강화한다고 했는데 이 정부는 앞으로 어떻게 될지 모르겠습니다만은 원전 없이는 AI가 특히 전기를 많이 먹는데 해결하기 어렵습니다. 그래서 원전에 대해서 캐나다의 생각이 어떤지 특히 캐나다에서 지금 SMR 전 세계에서 가장 앞서서 SMR 달랑턴에 4기를 건설한다고 하는데 우리 경상북도 경주에 SMR 연구소를 만들었습니다. 그래서 SMR 산업단지도 만들고 그러면 여기에 대해서도 SMR 관련해서 캐나다와 우리가 협조할 일이 많이 있는데 그것도 경상북도가 앞장서서 하고 있는 일입니다. 그래서 총리께서 그 문제에 대해서 누구보다도 잘 알고 계시기 때문에 기후변화에 재생에너지 쉽게 우리나라에 말하는 RE100으로만 해결할 수 있느냐 원전을 어떻게 할 거냐 그중에 앞장서가는 SMR 우리가 기술연대를 어떻게 할 수 있는지 여기에 대해서 전문가답게 말씀을 좀 해주셨으면 좋겠습니다.
Thank you very much for your question. I had spent many, many years as an environmental activist. I studied environmental geography after being a math teacher, but before I got into politics. So I have always been extraordinarily focused on the need to fight climate change, but to do it in a way that grows our economy and creates good jobs for people in the future. In looking at energy demands for the future, even if you minimize the impact of AI, which we should minimize because it's going to be maximal, but as we need to reduce carbon emissions, we are going to need more and more electricity generation. You add AI into the mix, and there is no question that we're going to have to massively invest in more power generation. If we simply continue to expand our current generation using fossil fuels, even natural gas, which is the cleanest of fossil fuels, but is still a carbon-emitting fossil fuel, we are going to make our problems oh so much worse. Nuclear power must be part of the solution. There is no question about it. Canada has a long history of nuclear power. We developed the CANDU reactors decades ago, sold them around the world. They were a reactor that was specifically designed to be independent from a weapons development program on the nuclear side. Most nuclear power companies created nuclear energy and used those energies to also develop their nuclear weapons programs. Canada was one of the countries. There are others that made the decision never to go on the weapons side, but to develop nuclear power in a more peaceful way. We have recently not just invested in SMRs, but we are looking at getting back into the building of large-scale reactors. There's an updated version of the CANDU reactor called a Monarch reactor that is coming online soon. We have actually sold a number of our reactors already to countries like Romania. There's a lot of interest in Eastern Europe because they are trying to get away from a reliance on Russia for their nuclear industries, their uranium, their nuclear expertise, and Canada is a natural ally for exactly that. We will continue to work with partners around the world, like Korea, in how we develop our nuclear energies safely and responsibly, and expand nuclear footprints around the world safely and responsibly. Canada has a long-standing nuclear company in Cameco because we have significant stores of uranium. We recently bought, a Canadian company recently bought significant interest in Westinghouse, the American, formerly American, now Canadian nuclear company. So Canada is well positioned to move forward as a significant purveyor of clean energy through nuclear. The last comment I'll make is around small modular reactors. We know that those are going to be an incredibly important technology in the coming years, particularly for smaller communities or countries that don't necessarily have the capacity or the geography to be able to manage large-scale reactors. We're very excited that the first SMR in the world is going to come online in Darlington, Ontario, in Canada, in the coming years. And I know it's a technology that people are looking at with a lot of interest. So I very much appreciate your perspective on nuclear, Governor Lee, and look forward to continuing partnership, not just between Canada and Korea, but with your province as well.
예, 우리나라 월성 1호기 중수로로 만들었는데 그걸 캐나다 기술로 만들었더라고요. 그래서 캐나다가 원자력에 대해서는 굉장히 앞서가는 나라인데 소형 모듈 원자력 이게 이제 앞으로 전 세계가 꿈꾸는 원자력인데 이것을 캐나다가 또 앞장서서 지금 만들고 있고 우리 경상북도 경주에서 연구소와 산업단지를 만들었는데 우리는 한 3년 있으면 가능하다 이런데 캐나다는 벌써 설비를 시작했다니까 앞서가는 게 굉장히 부럽습니다. 하여튼 그에 대해서 협조를 바라는 마음이 간절하고 기술 협력을 기대하겠습니다. 그런데 미국이 원자력이 세계에서 가장 많습니다. 세계 원자력이 지금 한 건설을 하는 것까지 하면 한 800기가 가까이 되고 지금 가동 중인 게 한 430기 좀 되는데 미국에서 100기가 넘는데 그걸 지금 훨씬 2배가 넘는 걸 건설하려고 하는데 우리나라 기술 그 미국은 원자력을 먼저 만들었지만은 기술자들이 없어서 사실상 원자력 건설이 어려울 나라가 되었습니다. 캐나다는 지금 원자력을 17기가 있는 걸 알고 있는데 소형 모듈 원자력이라든지 이런 기술자들이 캐나다인으로 돼가 있는지 아니면 외국의 이민자들이 와서 그 미국의 뭐 구글이라든지 큰 회사들 일론 머스크라든지 이런 사람들이 들어가서 미국을 만들듯이 캐나다도 이민을 받아서 기술자들을 받아서 하는 건지 지금 얼마 전에 우리 현대차라든지 LG 솔루션이라든지 이런 데서 우리 기술자들이 들어갔다가 뭐 구금당하는 일이 있었습니다만은 미국에 그런 기술자들이 없습니다. 우리 공장을 지으려고 해도 미국에 기술자가 없습니다. 조선소를 우리가 만들어 주려 해도 미국에 기술자가 없습니다. 우리 기술이 들어가지 않으면 어려운데 캐나다는 자체 기술로 되는지 그래서 총리께서 지금까지 캐나다 한 매년 40만 명 이민을 받았거든요. 이민 정책에 대해서 이 기술자들 이주로 이민 받는 그런 기술 정책 우리나라도 지금 인구가 이렇게 줄어들기 시작하면은 이민을 받지 않고는 견디기 어려울 거다. 그래서 경상북도에서 먼저 이민 비자를 우리는 중앙정부에서 전부 다 하고 있습니다. 법무부에서 하고 있는 걸 시도지사한테 넘겨달라. 이걸 몇 번 요청을 했습니다. 왜냐하면 외국에 옳은 기술자나 일할 수 있는 사람을 우리 자매도시에 가서 많이 모집해서 올 수 있다. 그래서 넘겨달라고 요청을 했는데도 조금은 받겠습니다. 우리가 신청을 하면 자기들이 결론을 내주겠다. 이렇게 하는데 인구 문제, 그렇게 기술자뿐만 아니고 인구 문제. 대한민국은 그 60년대, 70년대는 1년에 100만 명씩 태어났습니다. 캐나다는 보니까 60년대, 70년대부터 현재까지 매년 35만 명 수준이 태어나더라고요. 해마다. 60년대나 지금이나 거의 같습니다. 1, 2만 차이입니다. 인구가 많이 늘어났는데도 이제 출산율이 줄어드니까 평균 35만 명 수준을 유지하는데 우리는 100만 명 태어나다가 20만 대로 떨어졌습니다. 한국이 세계에서 가장 먼저 소멸하는 나라가 된다 이런 이야기인데 이민 정책이 없어는 불가능한데 이민 받을 때도 이와 같이 기술자 위주로 이민 받는 전문가 위주로 이민을 받는, 또 일할 수 있는 사람을 받는 이런 이민 정책이 되었을 때 그 나라에 적응이 되겠느냐. 우리나라에서 가장 걱정하는 게 많은 사람들이 외국에 들어왔을 때 우리나라에서 적응하고 살 수 있겠느냐. 지금 다문화라고 이야기하는 그 사람들도 지금 한 100만 명 수준 되는데도 불구하고 굉장히 나라에서 어렵게 생각하고 있거든요. 이분들이 국방도 담당해야 되고 하는데 가능하겠느냐. 그래서 이 이민 문제에 대해서 전문가 트리도 총리께서는 매년 40명 이상 받았더라고요. 그에 대해서 좀 말씀을 주셨으면 고맙겠습니다.
I recognize that Canada and Korea are very different in terms of multicultural profile, but I also know that developed countries around the world are all facing, once they hit a certain level of development, lower birth rates and increasing need for labor and skilled labor and population growth that requires a reflection around immigration. Canada has been fortunate in that we have always had immigration from the original settlers who came and displaced the indigenous people who lived on the land to further waves of immigrants showing up. Canadian identity has always been plural. So we have been challenged to a certain extent to figure out as a country, if we don't have one language or one ethnicity or one shared history or one background or one religion, how do we define what a Canadian is? And the answer that we have developed is that we are people who share similar values and a similar outlook on life. From the very beginning, when Canada was just Indigenous people marginalized and English and French running the country, even from the very founding of Canada over 150 years ago, one individual had to accept that someone completely different from them in language, in history, in background, in religion, was every bit as much a Canadian as they were. And it wasn't necessarily easy. And our history, even our recent history, going back a few decades, is filled with examples of discrimination and clashes and conflicts between different cultures, religions, and ethnicities in Canada. But we have persevered. And we have created a country where we look at our differences as a source of strength, not a source of weakness, a way to learn from each other. There are a lot of comparisons made between the way the United States does immigration versus the way Canada does immigration. The United States is often compared to a melting pot, where you come from anywhere in the world and you rapidly try and become an American. And grandparents wouldn't teach their children or their grandchildren to speak the language of the old country. You'd say, oh no, you're an American now, you only speak English. And they change their names so that they don't appear to be anything other than anglicized. And within a generation or two, they have no ties or no collection. And this is not always, but this is often what happens in the United States, fewer ties to the home country. Canada chose a different path, where for us, you can be Korean Canadian or Kenyan Canadian or Afghan Canadian and not have to choose not have to let go of your language or your culture or your religion or your traditions, and instead you can bring them to add to the rich diversity of Canada. And I think the positive side of that model of immigration is it allows us to be better global citizens. If you look at a Canadian bank that's trying to open a branch in Vietnam, or in some region of Asia, they can look to find Canadians of that origin who perhaps work in the bank, who can go and help set up and make sure that the values that we have as Canadians that we share are properly moved forward within that particular location. So as the world gets more interconnected, as people are migrating more and more, it is absolutely right that countries like Korea look to build an immigration system. And you will make decisions about how you want to do that. But my best recommendation is that given that Korea has such an extraordinary history and identity and culture that has survived uniquely in a region surrounded by countries with other cultures and traditions, it will be in your interest to encourage whoever is coming from whatever country to build a life for themselves in Korea, to learn the language, to be able to start thinking of themselves as Korean, and to be recognized as Korean. Now, this is not something that will happen quickly. It usually takes a few generations. But it is something that allows for Korean identity to not be based on ethnicity, but to be based on pride in Korean culture and history and understanding of the way people live here, the values that define how Koreans are different from anyone else in the world, and allows you to have a definition of who is Korean that is not simply based on birth or ancestry, but on the kinds of values and love of kimchi and K-pop demon hunters that defines, to be silly about things, that defines what your culture is. And that is a difficult step. And even in Canada, in the years following World War II, when large numbers of Italians and Greeks and Portuguese and others came over from Europe, they had the same language. They had the same religion, they had different languages, but a very similar culture in many ways. And there was still terrible discrimination because they weren't real Canadians. It was the 50s and 60s. It won't be easy. But it is something, if you realize that your strength as Koreans doesn't have to do with birth, right, or ancestry. It has to do with this incredible, vibrant, diverse country, diverse in perspectives, diverse in stories that you've created. Then welcoming people in the world who want to choose to be Korean and not just happen to because they were born here can be a real strength. And I congratulate you, Governor Lee, for your reflections on this and for your looking to build it. To answer another quick question, yes, we put in place accelerated visa processes for expert engineers and programmers and people in jobs that have, that if they came, they could come and work and live in Canada and have pathways to citizenship. And it's been very successful because we've been welcoming people at a time when other countries were turning them away, and we got a lot of engineers that otherwise might have ended up in the United States, and that was good for our economy.
예, 우리 트리도 총리한테 사전에 무슨 어떤 질문을 하겠다, 무슨 내용을 이야기하겠다 자료를 준 것도 아닌데 뭐 마물 박사 같네요. 박수 한번 보내주시기 바랍니다. 한국의 정치
Over the course of my life, I've had a lot of questions on Canadian immigration as Prime Minister, and I'm happy to talk about that.
한국의 사람들이 IQ 검사하면 세계에서 1, 2등 간다 이렇게 돼가 있거든요. 그런데 영어 공부를 어떻게 대학까지 졸업했는데도 어디 가면은 글을 보면 하는데 말을 못하고 또 이런 대화를 하면 A4 용지 없으면 못하고 그런 습관화가 돼가 있는데 우리도 좀 자신 있게 이야기할 수 있는 그런 걸 만들어야 됐다 생각하는 게 외국의 정치인들 보면은 언제 어디서 물어도 뭐 준비된 것처럼 이야기하거든요. 트럼프 대통령도 보면은 항상 뭐 아무것도 없이 막 이야기하더라고요. 한국에는 아무것도 없이 이야기했다가 난리 납니다. 하여튼 다음에 뭐 거기 틀리다 하고 있던 언론인들도 좀 틀리더라도 봐줘야 되는데 오늘 보니까 준비를 안 하시는 것 같은데 미리 다 준비가 돼가 있는 게 정치인이구나 이런 생각이 많이 듭니다. 그래서 제가 여주에 대한민국이 정체성이 뭐냐, 뭐 김치하고 케이팝의 정체성이 그걸 자꾸 이야기하면 조상 누구냐 얘기하면 안 된다 이런 이야기 같은데 한국을 사랑하고 한국을 좋아하면 한국 사람이 되는 그런 시대 만들어야 된다는 생각이 들고 우리는 이미 그래 왔습니다. 신라가 삼국 통일을 했는데 삼국 통일 주역이 김유신입니다. 김유신은 가야 사람입니다. 가야 사람이 지금은 말하면 합참의장이 된 겁니다. 합참의장이. 우리는 이 전통의 역사가 그래 왔는데 자꾸 우리가 단일민족이다 단일민족이다 이야기하는 바람에 이민에 대한 다양성이 부족한 나라가 된 것 같습니다. 지금 우리나라 성씨가 5천 몇 가지가 있는데요. 외국에서 들어온 성씨가 반 이상입니다. 훨씬 많습니다. 여기 지금 자기 성씨들 되면은 다 중국에서 온 사람 대부분이고 만주에서 온 사람 이런 사람들입니다. 그런데 우리가 다양한 민족이었는데 단일 민족이라 이야기를 하다 보니까 이민에 대해서 굉장히 거부감이 있고 우리하고 색깔이 다르면 좀 거부감이 많은데 또 흰 색깔에 대해서는 거부감이 적고 우리보다 다른 까만 색깔이 이런 데 거부감이 있는데 이걸 떨쳐버리는 것이 초인류 국가로 가는 길이라 생각합니다. 그래서 저는 이미 우리 조상들은 잘해왔었다. 포용성이 있었다. 이런 생각을 갖습니다. 신라를 보면 알 수 있습니다. 신라는 많은 나라와 교류를 했고 그래서 삼국 통일됐는데 이 호텔이 이름이 신라입니다. 신라호텔. 이 경주에 있어야 되는데 서울에 와 있더라고요. 신라호텔. 우리 트리더 총리가 묵는 호텔이 신라호텔이 이 신라의 경주에서 지금 에이펙이 열리는데 한국에서 에이펙이 열리는 것은 굉장히 의미가 있다고 생각합니다. 왜? 한국은 세계에서 가장 못 사는 나라였습니다. 6.25 전쟁 때 메가더 장군이 전쟁 마치고 가면서 한국은 100년 이내에는 일어서기 어렵다 이렇게 이야기했습니다. 그런데 6.25 전쟁 끝나고 35년 만에 88 올림픽을 했습니다. 88 올림픽 할 때 전 세계인들이 와서 깜짝 놀랐습니다. 코리아라는 이름도 몰랐는데 보니까 이렇게 나라가 잘 살게 됐느냐. 기껏 기억하는 거는 코리아 월 전쟁부에 몰랐다. 6.25 전쟁만 알았는데 이렇게 잘 사는 나라가 됐느냐. 그 다음에 2002년 월드컵을 하는데 일본하고 우리 공동 개최했거든요. 일본보다 우리가 더 잘 사는 나라인 줄 알았다. 일본보다. 현재는 우리가 일본보다 국민소득이 더 높아졌습니다. 대기업 임금이 일본 임금보다 더 높습니다. 그렇게 세계에서 10번째 되는 이 경제 대국이 되었고 2002년 월드컵을 하면서 우리가 선진국으로 도약을 했습니다. 그리고 이제 에이펙을 2025년 경주에서 개최하는데 이제 50일 정도 남았습니다. 그래서 에이펙을 개최하면은 우리가 초인류 국가로 가야 되는데 초인류 국가로 가려면 포용과 성장 이게 다른 나라에서 모범이 돼야 되고 다른 나라의 기술을 인수해 줘야 되고 우리 모델을 만들어서 민주주의를 잘했다. 그럼 민주주의 모델을 만들어서 수출을 해야 됩니다. 이런 일들을 우리가 할 수 있느냐. 그래서 캐나다는 이미 초인류 국가가 되었기 때문에 총리한테 우리 한국에서 개최되는 에이펙이 굉장히 의미가 있다. 왜? 가장 못 사는 나라에서 선진국 반열이 갔기 때문에 지금 에이펙 국가가 21개 나라가 있는데 그중에 반은 선진국이고 반은 개발도상국입니다. 그 선진국의 모든 기술과 그 글로벌 문제를 같이 의논을 해서 우리보다 어려운 나라에 우리가 전수해주는 그 사람들을 발전시켜주는 역할을 할 수 있는 우리가 가장 잘할 수 있다. 우리는 이미 몸으로 겪었기 때문에 밥도 못 먹는 나라에서 이렇게 밥이 남아도는 우리 음식 쓰레기가 1년에 25조입니다. 북한의 총 생산량이 25조입니다. 저는 어디 가도 그런 이야기를 많이 북한에 1년 내에 돈벌이 해가 열심히 벌었는 거기 생산이 우리가 음식 먹고 버리는 것 같다. 이 정도 잘 사는 나라가 됐습니다. 그래서 이런 우리가 잘 사는 것을 모범을 우리보다 어려운 나라에 보여주고 선진국가는 기술 협력을 같이 하는 이런 에이펙의 의미가 있다. 이 생각을 갖고 특별히 경상북도는 새마을에 관련해서는 지금까지 우리 경북 단독으로 16개 나라의 90개 지역의 새마을을 전술했습니다. 이게 금년도부터는 ODA 사업으로 국가에서 12개 나라에 100개 지역, 나라마다 100개 지역을 새마을 사업을 해주는 사업으로 채택이 됐습니다. 그중에 우리 경북이 5개 나라를 합니다. 그래서 저는 이런 새마을 사업이 공동으로 잘 사는 사업으로 유엔에서도 인정을 했지만 이런 일들을 공동으로 할 수 있는 에이펙이 된다 생각하면서 한국에서 특히 우리 경상북도 경주에 개최되는 이번 에이펙이 에이펙 국가 중에서도 가장 공동 현안을 해결할 수 있는 대한민국이 모델 국가가 되는 모범 국가가 되는 그런 역할을 할 수 있다고 생각하는데 총리께서 대한민국의 현 상태와 우리가 할 역할과 캐나다 우리가 협조해서 할 일에 대해서 좀 말씀을 주시면 좋겠습니다.
I think many of the developing countries in the world look at the incredible success Korea has been able to achieve and are trying to figure out how they can do that too. Your example, your leadership is sorely needed in the world right now. One of the things that we have seen, unfortunately, is increasing misunderstandings and divides between the global north and the global south, as it is said. A number of larger countries of the global south have tried to encourage a competition, or at least a challenge of the rules-based order, but not based on something that I think most developed country leaders would agree with, the need to create more prosperity and opportunity for people in the global south, but a desire by certain large players of the global south, I think you can imagine a few of them, wanting to simply replace the system in the global north with their own leadership. And the ability to bring developing countries to a place of prosperity in looking for genuine win-wins is something that is limited by the skepticism and the mistrust of countries with colonial or imperial pasts. Certainly, from my own experience, when I look to Africa, Canada has always had an excellent partnership with many African countries because we didn't have a colonial history in Canada, in Africa, like many of the European powers, and therefore when we showed up to build a well or rebuild a city or help out with schools and development, people had the sense that we were just doing it because we wanted to see them succeed. Well, that is certainly a role that I can see Korea playing in a vital way around the world, where you were a country that a few decades ago was in a very similar place to many developing countries right now, and you've demonstrated an ability to build extraordinary success as a country. And for more people to look at what you were able to do and say, we want to be like that, we want to find our ways of succeeding, looking to countries like Korea or Canada or other middle powers, as opposed to being caught in a tug of war between United States and China and Russia and India and all the other countries that seem to be, trying to, or seem to be more self-interested, perhaps. Whether they are or aren't, there's a perception there that you are not hampered with, and sometimes Canada is not hampered with. So I congratulate your interest in stepping up to share Korea's success and model with the world. It is a kind of leadership that we need to see more of, and I look forward to seeing what Korea is going to be able to do to help solve big problems around the world through your own hard-won experience.
네. 한국말보다도 영어로 하니까 영어가 조금 더 통역이 더 빨리 끝나는 거예요. 한국말이 좀 더 어려운 건데 뭐. 통역이 조금 더 느리게 나오더라고요. 오늘 시간이 지금 8분 남았다 이 말인가요, 이게 지금? 예? 예. 8분 안에 끝내려고 하면 인사말하고 마쳐야 되는데 물어볼 거는 천지빛깔인데 천지빛깔이 아는 사람? 이 말이 다 다르잖아요. 원래 우리 경상북도 말이 표준말이었어요. 신라말이 표준말이기 때문에 천지빛깔이 많다 이 말, 세빌렀다 이 말인데 또 세빌렀다가 또 아느냐 이게. 하여튼 오늘 함께해 주신 여러분들께 진심으로 감사드리고 이번 경주 에이펙이 첫째로는 경제회의체입니다. 경제회의체. 경제 문제를 다루고 최태원 회장부터 상위 회장님이 적극적으로 나서서 전 세계의 인재들을 무슨 젠슨 황이나 일론 머스크나 이런 분들을 다 모셔오겠다 이렇게 말씀을 하고 계시고 그 다음에 우리는 문화를 보여줘야 된다. 지금 K-팝 뭐 이것이 영화에 나와가지고 K-헌데 뭐 이런 것들이 영화를 굉장하잖아요 지금. 그래서 이 문화를 보여주는 우리 한류의 발상지가 경상북도입니다 원래. 그 한류 발상지를 보여주는 경주 문화 에이펙이 되도록 하는데 노력을 하고 그 다음에 더 중요한 것은 러시아 우크라이나 전쟁 끝나고 푸틴 대통령이 참석하도록 해야 된다. 그래 푸틴 대통령이 전쟁 때문에 거의 에이펙을 참석을 못했습니다. 푸틴 대통령이 오면은 또 트럼프 형님한테 이야기해서 김정은이 좀 데리고 오느라 김정은이 좀 모시고 오면은 그 하노이 빅딜을 실패했는데 경주 빅딜로 성공을 시키자. 제가 대통령 후보 나가서 한 이야기입니다 이게. 그래서 이재명 대통령 보고 꼭 이야기 좀 해달라 했더니 가서 또 이야기를 하시더라고요. 했는데 김정은이 콧대가 얼마나 세졌는지 북중러 서고 난 다음에 많이 좀 달라질 것 같은데 그래도 잘 설득을 해서 경주까지 못 오면 판문점에 따라 와서 빅딜을 성공하면은 한반도 평화에 기여하는 한반도 평화가 곧 세계 평화가 됩니다. 캐나다에서 6.25 때 우리한테 많은 군인을 보내주고 사상자도 많이 났습니다. 그래서 이런 도움을 받던 나라였는데 이제는 세계 평화에 기여하는 이런 에이펙이 되도록 하는데 최선을 다하겠다 이 말씀을 드리고 경주 에이펙은 늦게 시작했습니다. 빨리 발표를 못했는 게 그때 총선이 있어서 빨리 발표를 못해서 인천과 제주 그 다음에 경주가 붙었는데 제가 가서 PT를 잘해가 우리가 이겼습니다 사실. 인천한테 게임이 안 됐어요. 인천이 워낙 시설이 호텔 많지요. 그 다음에 이런 컨벤션 크지요. 그래 우리 저 담당 국장이 저 와 있는데 갔다 오더니 포기해야 되겠습니다. 이래 이야기하더라고요. 왜? 그러니까 게임이 안 됩니다 이게. 어마무시합니다 그거는. 그래서 내가 그 사람들한테 물어봐라. 불국사 있느냐? 첨성대 거 있나? 세계 문화유산이 전부 다 거 있는데 그런 것들을 보여줘야 되지. 제가 PT 가서 한 이야기입니다. 그분들이 미국 대통령, 캐나다 총리, 중국 주석 이런 사람들이 호텔 좋다고 놀래겠느냐? 호텔 방이 너무 좋습니다. 신라호텔에 자도 안 놀래고 있잖아요. 지금 신라호텔에 자도. 신라호텔보다 더 좋은 데가 있느냐? 그런데 잠자러 옵니까? 이랬다 하니까 심판관들이 그렇지 이철우 도지사가 잠자러 오느냐? 잠자러 오는 건 아니지. 이래가 경주가 16명 투표해가지고 13표를 얻었습니다. 13표. 네. 그래서 그 에이펙이 이번에 세계에 기여하는 그런 포용과 성장에 기여하는 그런 APEC이 되도록 준비를 철저히 하고 있다는 말씀을 드리고 매경에서 그런 내용을 잘 실어서 APEC이 성공하도록 좀 도와주시기 바랍니다. 오늘 저는 트리도 총리와 대담을 하면서 역시 그 큰 나라를 10년간 이끌어오는 지도자가 좀 다르다, 철학이 다르구나, 세계 평화에 기여하는, 세계 번영에 기여하는 더 큰 일을 해달라, 이런 당부를 드리면서 제 인사말 마치고 트리도 총리에게 마지막 인사말을 당부드리도록 하겠습니다.
You've said so much. There's not so much for me to add, other than it will be, as I said on the outset, a very important time for APEC to gather. And I know you will demonstrate the kind of visionary leadership that Korea has been sharing with the world over the past while to make sure that the conversation around how we build a strong and prosperous Asia-Pacific economies, how we ensure that people are included in the success that we are building, that people feel optimistic about their future, they feel seen, they feel engaged by this world that is in such transformation right now. It is easy for individuals to feel lost and overwhelmed, to show that leaders are actually thinking about them and trying to build a more prosperous society that includes everyone and tackle the big problems we're facing is something that is always important for people to understand. And I know that the APEC meeting that you will host will be a tremendous, tremendous success. I am envious of the current Prime Minister of Canada who will get to spend time in your beautiful province, but at least I stayed at the Shilla Hotel here in Seoul. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the insightful session once again to Governor Lee Cheol-woo of Gyeongsang-buk-do and Mr. Justin Trudeau. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give our two gentlemen another big round of applause. Thank you very much. Thank you. And now I would like to
Just a
invite...
moment. 플로의 질문, 총리께 질문을 하든지 저한테 질문을 하든지 질문 한 사람만 받더라고요. 한 사람. 예, 한 사람만. 예.
So now we will open the floor to questions. We're going to be receiving one question. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. My name is Do-young Shim. I was in the morning at the opening session, and Mr. Prime Minister, you delivered such a beautiful speech, and I think everybody was quite impressed, and I congratulate you for soft landing to Korea. And I want to say thank you to Governor Lee. I've known him for many, many years, and I'm very happy that he recovered that treacherous disease. I congratulate him. But let me just ask you a question, Mr. Prime Minister, because you have such a long experience. APEC is coming to Gyeongju. Of course, Gyeongju is not Seoul, Gyeongju is not Incheon. But Gyeongju is a very traditional town, historical town. When we were young, we always went to school excursion to Gyeongju. So now, at the end of the day, many countries, many cities want to host international events, Olympics, World Cup, and then APEC and all this. And I would like to see if there's any couple of recommendations you can make. How do we keep Gyeongju alive and have more visitors come to Gyeongju after the APEC? At the end of the day, I belong to tourism industry, and at the end of the day, what is successful living for the people in Gyeongju, citizens of Gyeongju, is who comes and how many comes and revisit Gyeongju. So I'd like to ask you your experience of the countries that you hosted international events. Thank you.
No, thank you for your question. As Prime Minister over 10 years, we hosted many different international events, including planning for 2 different G7s. I chose a location for both of those G7s in small, beautiful rural areas where the leaders could enjoy and appreciate the real energy of the place. If you come to a city like Seoul, you'll be in the convention center, you'll be in a motorcade to the airport, you'll come back, and you won't see the beauty. Yes, welcoming a summit can cause disruption and hardship for the locals while it's on. Security requirements are always a challenge. But if it is done right, you can also bring the attention of the world to the beauty and the special quality of one of the places that is the place that was chosen. You can, when it works ideally, give a bit of a real experience to leaders who honestly are often going from airports to convention centers to presidential palaces, back to the fancy hotel, and then back to the airport, and don't actually see the beauty of the country. I have to say, my last trip to Seoul as Prime Minister was wonderful. I got to see a few nice things, but it wasn't anything compared to what I got to do now coming to this, where I could wander the streets, go to little restaurants without the kind of security and entourage that I have. So when you have an opportunity with a summit like this, as long as it is done right and thoughtfully, you can take advantage of the attention of the world or just the attention of the country. You can build a few more facilities that won't just be there for the actual summit, but turn into an excellent hotel for tourists to visit for years to come. And getting that balance right is very difficult, but I always see it as an opportunity to showcase the best of a particular place, as long as it is managed carefully. And I wish you all the best of luck in welcoming not just leaders from across the region to your beautiful province in 50 days, but welcoming more and more people who will discover it through the pictures of the leaders and the news that comes out of that meeting and come and visit for themselves.
시간이 되면 아까 질문 한 사람만 더 받도록 하겠습니다. 예. 마이크 좀 드리세요. Last question.
Yes, hi, my name is Andrew. I work for the Team Canada here in the Quebec team. So I do research innovation in terms of Quebec and Korea. So I'm a Korean Canadian, so it's an honor to be here, Prime Minister. The question I actually had is, just recently we had a big event in Canada called Canada Conference on Science and Technology. Prime Minister, you're probably aware because you did some welcome remarks back in the days. So this year it was held in Montreal. About 400 top scientists, government officials went, and one of their mandate was to learn from Quebec and Canada how they retain but also attract talent, because Korea has this kind of issues. I'm sure you know AI, quantum, all these big sectors. Everyone's trying to attract talent, and Canada's very good at that. You mentioned diversity is strength, multiculturalism. But if you had to give some more advice to Korea in terms of attracting talent, retaining them, what kind of advice would you be able to give?
Canada has long had the challenge that our most brilliant researchers and academics and particularly innovators in more commercial fields get offered much larger salaries in American dollars down in Silicon Valley. And we have had to compete to retain talent and to draw talent in. We do that sometimes by being able to match, to a certain extent, salaries, but the Americans will usually have deeper pockets than us. We play up quality of life. We play off community safety. If you want to come with your family, we have some extraordinarily good public schools for the kids. We have safe neighborhoods. We have beautiful wilderness. We have great Korean food and every other different food you can imagine from the world because of our multicultural societies. We are a welcoming country, and sometimes people who only go for the money to the United States regret their choice of that. And I think there are ways to draw people in for the vibrancy and the quality of life in Korea, even if maybe the money might be better elsewhere. But I also know you guys are paying good salaries too. So there's lots of things you can do to try and draw people in, but you have to look at the fact that people are now looking for better quality of life than they are just the biggest possible bank account. Or at least the ones that we like to accept in Canada are the ones who understand quality of life is important, because they fit in very well in Canada as well. But thank you for your question.
Thank you very much for the questions and the answers as well. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give our two gentlemen another big round of applause for the wonderful session.
기념사진 한번 찍게 나오세요.
So now, ladies and gentlemen, we would like to proceed to a commemorative photo session. So please, I would like to invite the guests to come forward to the stage for the commemorative photo session. Thank you very much for your cooperation. Anyone who would like to join for the commemorative photo session, please feel free to join us in front of the stage. Thank you very much for your cooperation. And ladies and gentlemen, today's dialogue has reminded us that Korean identity, just like any other identity, is not simply rooted in ethnicity, but in the values, culture, and spirit that continue to thrive both here and abroad. I believe our distinguished guests are now ready on stage, so please face the camera. And please put on your biggest smiles. Thank you very much. The spirit of openness and inclusivity echoes in the vision of APEC, building growth that is not only dynamic, but truly inclusive for all. Thank you very much for your cooperation. Your biggest and brightest smiles, ladies and gentlemen. And for our participants, let's give our guests another big round of applause. We are celebrating a very special day today. Thank you very much for your cooperation and your participation. Thank you very much once again. And now we would like to conclude this session. Thank you very much once again. And ladies and gentlemen, the next session, session 2, APEC 2, the future of APEC and the global geoeconomic order, will begin at 3 p.m. For session preparation, we kindly ask you to exit the hall and re-enter by scanning your QR code at the entrance. Thank you very much for your cooperation. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, the second session of the APEC Gyeongbuk Knowledge Forum is now underway. In this session, we will explore the challenges and opportunities facing APEC amid rapidly shifting geopolitical dynamics as well as pathways for sustainable development. The session is entitled APEC 2, The Future of APEC and the Global Geoeconomic Order. And at this time, we are very honored to have Mr. Henry Haggard, former director at the National Security Council, as our moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, let's greet our moderator with a big round of applause. Thank you very much. And also, please join me in giving a warm welcome to our distinguished panel speakers, Professor John Mearsheimer, the University of Chicago, and Dr. Robin Niblett, fellow at the Chatham House. Thank you very much.
Hello, greetings. Thank you so much for inviting us to the stage here. This is really an honor to have this opportunity, to have this conversation with two of the greatest thinkers on international relations, Dr. Mearsheimer and Sir Robin Niblett. I'm really looking forward to having a conversation where we can explore some of the challenges and opportunities facing APEC and facing the region, and maybe looking into a bit how Korea fits into the conversation and how APEC, along with G20 and other international institutions, maybe can contribute to this time of transition. So before I hand it over to the distinguished panelists, just we know them all. Dr. Mearsheimer, distinguished Chicago chaired professor and leading proponent of political realism. He'll offer us some really great insights on power competition and how it's reshaping the geoeconomic landscape. And Sir Robin Niblett, former director of Chatham House, I'm looking forward to hearing about his perspectives on the evolving relationship between the United States and China as he laid out in his book, The New Cold War. So please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Mearsheimer and Sir Robin Niblett. So Dr. Mearsheimer, over to you. The mic is yours. Could you please share your perspectives on what APEC is looking like these days and how it's looking to the future?
Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with my two colleagues, and especially to be back in South Korea, which is one of my favorite countries on the planet. I always love coming here and meeting with people and talking. The subject on the table today is basically the future of APEC and the future of the global order. And when we talk about the global order, we're more or less referring to what people call the liberal international order. And my argument is that the future of APEC and the future of the liberal international order is not very promising. There's big trouble ahead. And the principal reason for that is the shift from a unipolar world to a multipolar world. And I'll explain more about what I mean by that. But I want to start off with a number of definitions to begin with, to give you a sense of the big picture, because I think you can only understand where APEC is headed and where the global order is headed if you want, by understanding what those terms mean. What is the relationship between APEC and the global order? And APEC is an institution. It's one institution, and an institution is different from an order. And what exactly do I mean by that? An institution is a body of rules. It's very important to understand that that's what institutions are. They're rules that allow the member states to interact with each other. They prescribe certain forms of acceptable behavior, and they proscribe unacceptable forms of behavior. That's what an institution is. APEC is an institution. NATO is an institution. An order, on the other hand, is a nest or a group of institutions that fit loosely together, that are also designed to manage relations among a group of states. So APEC is a building block in the global order, in the international order. So that's what you definitely have to keep in mind. Now, the second thing you want to understand is that great powers create institutions and great powers manage institutions. Countries like the United States, not South Korea, build institutions and they build orders. Furthermore, you want to keep in mind that institutions and orders can deal with security or economic issues, to put it in rather broad terms. So to go back to the Cold War, you had NATO and you had the European Community, which became the European Union. NATO was a security institution, and the European Community was an economic institution. And I'll talk more about this in a minute, but they were all part of the Western order. There was a Western order in which NATO and the European Community fit. Now, the next definitional issue, and the last one, which you want to pay a lot of attention to, is that there's a distinction between bounded orders and international orders. An international order includes all of the great powers in the system. A bounded order only includes one of the great powers. It does not include all of the other great powers. Now you're probably saying to yourself, what exactly is he talking about? Is this political science speak? You know, bounded orders, international orders? I'll make it clear to you by talking about the Cold War, the unipolar moment, and the present. When I grew up during the Cold War, we had 3 orders. 2 of them, which were the most important orders, were bounded orders. The Western order, which is sometimes mistakenly called an international order, was run by the United States. It was set up by the United States to wage the Cold War. It was basically run by the United States. That Western order included NATO, it included the World Bank, the IMF, the European Community. All of those institutions were bundled together in the Western order, which was initially designed to manage the Cold War. The Soviet Union, which was the other great power in the system, was not in the Western order. The Soviet Union had an order of its own. It had a bounded order. That bounded order included Comecon, the Warsaw Pact, and the successor organization to the Communist International. So these 2 bounded orders waged the Cold War. We also had an international order. That international order included the United Nations, because the United States and the Soviet Union were both in that institution. They were in that order. So the UN, a variety of arms control agreements, the NPT, they were all part of this thin international order. But the thick orders that really mattered during the Cold War were the Western order and the Communist order. 2 bounded orders and a thin international order. Then you all remember the Cold War ends in 1989. In December of 1991, the Soviet Union collapses and we go into the unipolar movement. By definition, there is only one great power on the planet. That's the United States of America. We are now in a position where the bounded orders disappear. The Soviet order disappears. The Soviet Union disappears. No more Warsaw Pact, no more Comecon, so forth and so on. What the United States does as the only great power on the planet is that it takes its bounded order, that Western order, and it makes it a truly international order. That's the order, that's the liberal international order. You get a really potent international order for the first time because you only have one great power on the planet. And remember, as I told you, when you have only one great power on the planet, that one power writes the rules for the institutions and manages the order, you're going to have what we had during the unipolar moment. Well, roughly around 2017, what happens to the unipolar moment? It disappears. We're now in a multipolar world. You all understand that. There are three great powers on the planet: the United States, China, and and Russia. United States, China, and Russia. And the two most powerful states in that system, in this multipolar system, are the United States and China. So the question you want to ask yourself is, what is happening today in Asia? Well, just like the Cold War, you're getting two bounded orders, and you're going to end up with a thin or superficial international order. Just think about the Chinese. BRICS. The United States isn't in BRICS. China's in BRICS. Think about the Shanghai Cooperative Organization. Think about Belt and Road. Think about the AIIB. These are all Chinese-led institutions. The Chinese are also forming military alliances with countries like Pakistan, countries like Russia, countries like Laos, countries like Myanmar. This is hardly surprising at all. You're getting a bounded order in East Asia. At the same time, the United States is doing the same thing. The Quad, AUKUS, tightening up of the bilateral alliances involving the United States and Japan, the United States and South Korea, the United States and the Philippines. You're going to get two bounded orders in Asia, in East Asia, and those two bounded orders are going to wage a wicked security competition, just like the United States and the Soviets did during the Cold War. Now you're saying to yourself, what does this have to do with APEC? The answer is very simple. APEC is an international institution, right? It's an international institution, and it's part of the international order. A really good example here you want to think about is the WTO. In 2001, the United States brought China into the WTO with great enthusiasm from first the Clinton administration, then the Bush administration. The World Trade Organization was going to help make China rich. We were really enthusiastic about that. Where is the World Trade Organization today? It's in the toilet bowl. It's in the toilet bowl. Why? We went from unipolarity to multipolarity. And you all understand, once you're in the world of multipolarity, great power security competition is back on the table. And when great power security competition is back on the table, and you've got at least two great powers in the system, you end up with bounded orders. And you still have an international order. You still have a United Nations. You still have a WTO. You still have APEC. But they are thin institutions. They do not matter that much. The bounded orders matter the most. Why? Because security always trumps economics. And therefore, APEC, which grew up in the unipolar moment and flourished in the unipolar moment, is now in an environment, multipolarity, that is not conducive to growth. It's not conducive to doing a lot to facilitate prosperity and security in Asia. So that is, in a nutshell, my basic story about where APEC is today and where it's headed. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Mearsheimer. That's a great introduction to really place this conversation in both history and in structure. And I think it's a great opportunity to turn to Sir Robin to maybe pull out a bit the US-China piece of the story that you've just told And maybe, so over to you to see how you describe what we're looking at.
Thanks very much, and fantastic to be back at the World Knowledge Forum, and great to be on the panel, Henry, with you, and obviously with Professor Mearsheimer. I was taking notes because it was a chance for me to get some great insights to the context of where we are right now. I look forward to talking about how much the SCO or the BRICS is a bounded order. That'll be a good thing to talk about when we come to the panel in a minute. I think China would like it to be. Whether it is will be debatable. But let me put APEC in its context for me, and I think it'll pull hopefully nicely off John's comments just beforehand. I want to make 5 points. The first is that it strikes me that APEC is, I'm trying to think of the right word, an echo, a hangover of the period of that post-Cold War optimistic period where we thought that globalization would be the future of the world and that the Western international order would become the international order, to use John Mearsheimer's, I think, very accurate description. But of course, it is being undermined right now, APEC, like globalization, by the emergence of what I think of as a new Cold War between the US and China, whatever we want to call it, deep geopolitical competition. And the second point I want to make is just to point out the extent to which APEC actually contains many of the fault lines that characterize this order. However, as I go on, let me just say, I think I could be a little more optimistic about the role that APEC might be able to play in the current international context. I'll say a word or two about that at the end. So just the first point. It does strike me that I was looking at the website of APEC before coming here, because being a Brit, we don't focus as much on APEC. We might focus on the European Union, and if you're British, not being inside the European Union. But if you look at the APEC website, it has this little thing going on of thousands of containers, and the containers are getting pulled left, right, and center. The image is we're all together building a united economic, order or system in the Asia-Pacific region. Well, I can't think of any more that represented the past and certainly doesn't seem to be representing the immediate future. It was all about absolute gains, the opposite of zero sum, if I can drift a little bit into international relations theory. And if you look at the period since APEC was founded, certainly you've seen some huge benefit from that deeper economic integration that accompanied the end of the Cold War, the reduction of barriers to trade, the belief in open markets that expanded after the collapse of the Soviet Union. You've had real GDP increase in that period between 1989 and 1990, and roughly 21, 22, from about $19 trillion to over $53 trillion amongst APEC members, 4 times increase in per capita income, 9 times increase in the rate of trade amongst the members, 2/3 of the trade now taking place amongst the Asia-Pacific region. I mean, you could say it really does, it's had its period of great optimism. But if we look at it today, it now contains right at its heart, because it has the US and China in it, it has got the new Cold War physically inside that actual institution. We don't need to talk too much about that now. We can if we want to. My sense is the US-China contest, what to me is a new Cold War, is going to persist and endure for a long time in the future. It's at the economic, it's at the military, it's the technological, I would even say at ideological levels. But what's interesting is that its front line is the Asia-Pacific region. It's not Europe. You could put Taiwan right at the core of it if you want to, given China's determination to break the first island chain of islands that in a way threaten its geoeconomic security, its ability to reach out to global markets overseas and not have to rely as much on Russia overland behind it. So when you look at the nature of that competition right now, APEC countries themselves are getting pulled into the competition. Not only do we have the United States imposing tech restrictions directly on China and limiting the kind of American technology that can be exported to China, and China retaliating with limits on rare earth exports, you've also got the South Korean semiconductor industry being told, as an ally of America, that it can no longer export its semiconductor manufacturing capabilities into its plants that have been built in China. As part of that win-win kind of world, the absolute gains world that we thought of before, that is now being limited. Japanese have been told that they can't sell their semiconductor manufacturing equipment to China, just like ASML, the Dutch company, can't do either. Malaysian data center companies who thought they could be bringing in Chinese components and still serve as partners to American and Western companies are now having to rethink what components do we have inside our data centers. So we're in a situation where the whole logic of APEC, one building on deeper integration, moving into the technology realm, is now being pushed backwards by an expansion of the US-China technological, which is economic and military contest, through to them. We've also got, secondly, actually more traditional security front lines of the new Cold War running through the middle of APEC as well. China and the Philippines are both APEC members. And there's no more strong example right now of both the Biden and Trump administration's determination to strengthen their resistance to China's growing military capability than the much closer military relationship they now have with the Philippines. It's amazing, if you think about it, that Chinese Taipei, as it's called, is a member of APEC. And here we have Taiwan right now being put, again, on the front line of this new Cold War, including with the Trump administration looking at it as part of its new kind of AI warfare supplier. You've got Russia as a member, being sanctioned by other APEC members. And you have got, as John noted, Russia and China trying to build, amongst some of the APEC members, an alternative world order through BRICS and SCO, in parallel to the United States trying to say, no, some of those countries are allies of ours, Japan, Australia, South Korea, even Singapore to a certain extent. You need to be with us on our side. So in a way, what you've got is geopolitics running through the middle of APEC. You've got the technology contest running through APEC. And of course, you also have, third, the good old-fashioned trade contest passing through the middle of APEC as well. Because I think the other big challenge to the future of APEC and to regional integration is the fact of the loss of confidence in globalization, the benefits of globalization that the United States in particular is running through. Donald Trump is the voice of the left behind in America who did not benefit from globalization. And so we're moving into an era led by the United States. In a way, it is enabling it. It is leading the way of state interventionism, protectionism, national preference, bilateralism. I might argue China never left those particular approaches. It's been subsidizing its own industries even as it's developed. It has built up huge overcapacity that it is now exporting to much of the rest of the world. But it's amazing to see the US leading the charge on forced inward investment, something we used to associate with China rather than with the United States. It's a whole discussion of energy dominance, not just energy independence. It's a completely different mentality, one that is anti-absolute gains and is all about zero-sum thinking. So again, I don't need to give you all the examples, but the impacts on APEC are fundamental because the US has said we'll have our own trade policy and we are going to whack tariffs up. Today, they're roughly 10 times what they were at the beginning of the year. US average tariffs have gone up from about 1.5% to 15% currently on average. I heard a panel earlier today where the South Korean and Japanese participants were comparing who had the worst deal on the forced foreign investment they would have to make in America in order to try and get their tariff rates down from 25% to 15%. And I think most interestingly for APEC, the kind of solution that many APEC members, especially ASEAN members, but also Mexico, maybe to a certain extent Canada, the solution they had to the beginning of the new Cold War, which was this famous China plus one idea. We will invest in China to get to the Chinese market. We will then invest if we are a multinational in Indonesia or in Malaysia or in some Singapore, in some other ASEAN country, and then export to America, Trump has said, no way. China plus one might be your language. I call it circumvention. I call it transshipment. And you will get a 40% tariff slapped on you. So APEC is also being undermined by this loss of confidence in globalization, the push towards state interventionism. Now, you talked about opportunities, Henry, so let me not all be negative and maybe hand over in the last couple of minutes onto how things might not be entirely negative. What can we do or what can, not we, I'm British, what can members of APEC do to try and deal with the situation? I mean, one option is keep APEC alive. Do what Shinzo Abe did in Japan with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Say, well, look, the US may not be a valuable player, but what the hell, we'll keep it going. Let's buy time. At some point, a future US administration might join. Now, another way to think about it is actually to be also, while you're buying time, think, you know what, Trump, his bark is worse than his bite. He says he's going to do all these things, but actually, you know what, we can keep doing triangulation. We can keep doing circumvention, because there's no way American customs officials are ever going to keep up with all of the complicated rules of origin, ideas that the Trump administration is trying to put in to avoid circumvention. And if you're not an ally of America, if you're Indonesia, if you're Malaysia, if you're Vietnam, you can probably get away with a lot tougher if you're Japan or South Korea and you depend on America for your security. There's also the option to go sub-regional within the APEC zone. ASEAN has a new 2026 economic community framework. We'll see what becomes of it, but there's also a new digital project to deepen digital trade. You've also got, interestingly, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, China-led initiative, but it's reduced tariffs on something like 90% of trade amongst the bulk of APEC members, excluding the United States, excluding Canada, excluding Mexico, excluding many of the, depends where you're looking at it, the American side of the Pacific side. But RCEP itself is a huge trade agreement. It's 3 billion people. It's 30% of the world GDP. And actually, in that typical Chinese way, it's quietly opening up markets amongst its members quite intelligently. Now, that's one way of looking at it. I think also, if I can think of it in a slightly more international relations standpoint, APEC is interesting because maybe it could also be a soft bridge for the US and China. APEC does not need to be dominated by the US and China. One of the most famous APEC summits recently was the 2023 one, when Biden met with Xi Jinping. They buried the hatchet. Many people are hoping that the meeting in Gyeongju in late October, maybe we will have another Trump-Xi meeting, and maybe again they will carry on the discussions on nuclear confidence-building measures, should we call them, that Trump certainly is incredibly supportive of, and I imagine Xi Jinping might be as well. So it may be that APEC provides, again, back to John, your point, being a bit of a part of an international system, because it's got Russia and the United States in it. Maybe they can use it as a framework to try to lessen some of the restrictions they have. But the last point, very last point I want to make, and maybe it's a little bit different from John's point, you described Henry at the beginning as John as part of the realist school of international relations. I'm a Brit. And when I did my PhD quite a long time ago, I discovered a thing called the English School of International Relations. And the English school believes that states tend to compete with each other all the time. They're not very utopian, but they do believe in a thing called international society, that the majority of countries do want rules, and it's possible that in the future, the majority of countries, including the majority of APEC, by deepening and thickening areas of sectoral and functional cooperation, for example, energy resilience, grids, standards for green technology, climate negotiations, in all of the areas that APEC is actually doing a lot of work, they might be able to sustain some of the thickening of the relationships. It won't be open trade anymore, but it might be a world in which continued foreign investment, continued economic progress can be made, and the US and China will be left to one side to worry about things on their side. That would be my optimistic outcome, to try and finish on a slightly up note.
Well, thanks for that. I think between these two presentations, we have the structure that's laid out, and I think some very detailed and insightful perspectives on how APEC could fit into that order. Before we go maybe further down the structural road, I'd like to bring it just briefly maybe to Korea. And just for you, Dr. Mearsheimer, just what kind of agency does a country like South Korea have in this the new order that you've described with, I mean, whether it's related to the thin bound order of institutional order that APEC represents, or in the more multipolar sense? And then for you, Sir Robin, just to maybe expand a little bit on what you hinted at, just what is South Korea, specifically is its kind of next step here, given what we've been laying out here today?
Let me just start by saying that Robin made the point, which I completely agree with, that states need rules. Institutions are of enormous importance in a complex world like the one that we live in. You absolutely need institutions and you need order. Now, the question is, what kind of agency does Korea have in this order? And the answer is not much at all. And there are two reasons for that. First of all, great powers build and maintain institutions, and great powers build and maintain orders. And Korea is allied with the United States. This is in Korea's national interest. But as you all know, the United States is a ruthless great power. It likes to portray itself as a benign great power. We're the good guys, the Chinese are the bad guys. It used to be that the Soviets were the bad guys. I don't believe any of this, right? The United States is a ruthless great power. It does what's in its interests. And Korea has to suffer the fact that it is in this alliance with the United States. It is part of the US-dominated order. And to make matters worse for Korea, Korea is a frontline state. If you're Australia, you're far enough away from China that you can get away with quite a bit. But if you're South Korea, there's not a lot that you can get away with. Japan can get away with more than South Korea can because Japan is a bigger country. South Korea is a small country, it's a frontline state, and it is in an order that is run by a ruthless great power. So the amount of maneuver room you have is not much at all. Am I happy about telling you that? No. I understand why a South Korean would not want to hear that message. But I am a realist with both a capital R and a little r.
Yeah, completely agree with that. Maybe let me pull off back where John is. And I was going to write down here, just written down for myself, because Korea has limited choices for the reason that John just said, it has to choose sides. So in this context, South Korea cannot be a swing player. The more meaningful, the more intense the new Cold War between the US and China, and it is at a phase where this Cold War does not have rules yet. We're not at the end of the Cold War, we're not even halfway through it. At least you had rules in the last one, but there are no rules yet in the US-China one, or very few. In that case, of that phase, or in this phase, South Korea has to pick sides. What do I mean by that specifically? And technologically, it has to pick the US. It has to obey the demand. Not to support China in its journey to become a more powerful technological competitor. Now, I might add, it's probably in South Korea's interest to do that, because it looks to me, I'm not an expert like some people are in where Chinese technology policy, capabilities are going, or South Korea's, but as an amateur looking at it from the outside, it looks to me that China is going to eat South Korea's lunch pretty soon in just about every area of technology. But the thing that South Korea will have is preferential access potentially to the US market and to the market of other US allies in Europe, in Australia, in Japan, where we're all going to have to make sure there's less Chinese technology. And although the South Korean technology might be a bit more expensive, it will be maybe not as heavily tariffed, and it will be allowed in because you're on the right side of the security contest with China. So I think you have to choose, go ahead and choose. That'd be the first point. Second, South Korea has a chance to be a reliable investor, specifically in the US. Despite this messy situation with the subcontractor workers at the Hyundai plant that has coincided with this meeting, teething troubles is the way I would describe it probably, but it's the right long-term play. And the more interesting play as well would be to see South Korean companies teamed up maybe with American companies going global to compete against the Chinese offer. The most obvious example being probably in nuclear technology, where Westinghouse can be a great partner to the very successful and good Chinese civil nuclear plant builders. And the third thing I would do, probably just as at the end of my remarks, South Korea as a small state, and John, you'd probably agree with this, we're all small states, unless you're one of the three great powers. One of the things Britain has learned, you're either small or you're smaller, and we're small. So small states have to find a way to team up, and we do need the rules. So I think that South Korea needs to be investing in APEC. I'm glad it's taking a lead on the energy cooperation side of the APEC agenda. It needs to invest in that. Hell, it maybe should invest in RCEP as well, which it is, because that is the chance for it to be able to at least trade on the non-sensitive side with China, and after all, Australia, Japan are in there as well. So I think they need to build up some of the rules. That would be a useful policy to do to hedge that great power alliance it has with America.
Thanks. I think that's some good tips for maybe to help the medicine go down from the tough message, realist message that Dr. Mearsheimer gave. Dr. Mearsheimer, you laid out the structure in your first remarks. I'd like to just maybe go back to that a little bit and just ask, how do you see that maybe competition being managed? I mean, you set up the structure, you told us what the moment is like. How does this not go horribly wrong? How does it maintain competition and not move into conflict in the way the structure that you've described?
Yeah, I mean, it's obvious that we want to make sure we don't have a war between the United States and China. And you can tell all sorts of stories about how you get a war in East Asia, in the South China Sea or over Taiwan. Here's the basic problem that you face. The basic problem is that anytime you get into a security competition involving countries like the United States and China, each side is trying to take advantage of the other side. They're competing for power. We're looking for opportunities to gain advantages over the Chinese, and the Chinese, for good reason, are looking to take advantage of us. I've said many times publicly, if I were the national security advisor in Beijing, I'd tell Xi Jinping, we want to push the Americans out of East Asia. We want to push them beyond the first island chain. We want to push them beyond the second island chain. And then we want to dominate East Asia. We want to tell the South Koreans and the Japanese that we call the tune in East Asia, and you dance to our tune. That's what I'd do if I were a Chinese leader. That's the way it works in the Western Hemisphere. That's how we run the Western Hemisphere. You've all heard about the Monroe Doctrine, right? But what you get here is you get two great powers who are competing with each other for advantage. When I was young, we used to talk about containment. You all know George Kennan was the father of containment. Then I came to realize, reading Bruce Cummings' work, you all know Bruce Cummings, I'm sure, who's one of the great Korean experts in the United States. But he taught me that the United States not only engaged in containment, we engaged in rollback. Rollback. And the first example of rollback was when we crossed the 38th parallel in 1950, right? We were trying to roll back the Soviets during the Cold War, right? So the problem that you face in the US-China competition is the United States won't merely be concerned with containment, it'll be interested in rollback. And I don't have to tell you that the mere mention of the word rollback tells you there's potential trouble. Now, just to get to the management side of the story, the upside, and it's a qualified upside, is we're talking about two countries that have lots of nuclear weapons. And you all know what happens if nuclear weapons get used. not good things. So we have a very powerful incentive to make sure that we don't get into a crisis, and that if we do get into a crisis, we manage it because of nuclear weapons. So I think paradoxically, nuclear weapons, the presence of nuclear weapons, give both sides really powerful incentives to manage the crisis. But I would juxtaposition that with the fact that good old-fashioned great power politics is a really nasty and brutal and dangerous business.
I'm going to stick with the hopeful note that you're saying that nuclear weapons, and that will help manage the conflict and keep us away from conflict.
Incentives to manage.
And maybe also to finish on another positive note to pull out from something we talked about already. You mentioned SCO and also other, Quad, but on both sides of the equation, these sub-groupings. But I'd also like to add in, for you, Sir Robin, the maybe not formalized groupings yet. I mean, there's AUKUS, but between Europe and Asia. And how can these groupings, subgroupings, contribute to this world order that Dr. Mearsheimer has laid out? How can they contribute, like you've mentioned with APEC, contribute to the management of this structure and to kind of the building of prosperity going forward?
One of the things that I'm interested in exploring, now that I've got a bit more time to explore things, is the extent to which the United States and China in particular, I think Russia is already a proof point of this, that these three great powers maybe are not as powerful as the great powers have been in past periods of history. It needs testing as a thesis, but if you look at the United States with its current debt level, you look at what Donald Trump considers, and some Democratic leaders also considered, the overuse of the dollar and America's hold of the choke points of the financial system, overuse of those tools as part of their foreign policy in the last 10 years. That is leading to a blowback and an effort to try to not be as reliant on the dollar as one has been in the past. Looking at China now using the weapon of its rare earth dominance, certainly of processing rare earths, now leading to European companies and Americans to think, well, hold on, we used to process rare earths, maybe we can do it in a different way. Maybe we don't even need magnets for very specific types of renewable energy, and we don't, as it turns out. It's all about money and supply chains. And then you look at, I don't need to talk to this audience here about China's demographic problems, its difficulty in transitioning from middle income to high income as a country. It strikes me this is an interesting moment for countries like Japan, like South Korea, like Australia, like Canada within APEC, but also, to your point, countries like Britain, Germany, France, the European Union as a whole, to think about how they can try to build up structures of cooperation that recognize the realities that we're still in a strongman world. We haven't got yet to a position, and we may never, where they don't wield ultimate influence, but certainly try to push it in that direction. And I think here, being a poison pill inside other institutions is not a bad thing. That's why I wanted to mention the BRICS. Clearly, China would like to use the BRICS club, and Russia would like to use it as a counterpoint to the G7. But, with India in there, which has a hugely suspicious relationship, to put it mildly, with China, with Brazil, again, not wanting to be couched as a pure anti-American player, it strikes me that's going to be a very difficult bounded order, if I can call BRICS a bounded order, to try to use to balance the existing or continuing American bounded order built around what is still, obviously, a very much existing NATO. So, similar in the SCO, you've got one or two members. Turkey showed up to the last meeting. You've got Saudi Arabia showing up, and some of the Gulf states. These are as well American allies. I mean, you've actually got bases, American bases in the Gulf states, and obviously American bases in Turkey as well. So it strikes me that you don't have a Warsaw Pact against NATO moment like you had in the last Cold War. In a way, both sides are trying to build teams, but the teams aren't as committed and maybe not quite as dependent as they were the last time round. After all, yes, Russia is a nuclear power, it threatens Europe, but Russia is struggling just to beat Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine, it's remarkable. So I think that there's an opportunity here, and we're seeing it with European countries trying to sustain some of the partnerships with their Asian counterparts to say, look, maybe we need to have our own life raft. Let's not rely as much on America for our future security. Who knows where we'll be there, where it will be after Trump has stepped down. Let's start developing our own future combat aircraft, things like the Brits are doing with the Italians and the Japanese. Let's keep up some form of Indo-Pacific strategy. Let's perhaps create an EU TPP trade deal that's being discussed right now. There's an EU-India deal that's perhaps going to be built at the moment. I think the smaller states are trying to test the thesis that we're not going to be dominated by the big ones next time round. At least you've got to try. They might fail, but have a go at it.
Can I make an optimistic, quasi-optimistic point? You know, I never want to be too optimistic. But it's important to understand that the United States cares greatly about three areas of the world. Europe, which has historically been the most important area of the world to the United States, but no longer is. The Middle East, and here mainly the Persian Gulf. And then three, East Asia. And East Asia is the most important part of the world for the United States strategically today because of the US-China competition. But the fact is that the United States is deeply enmeshed in wars in the Middle East, mainly because of our alliance with Israel. And there's a good chance, as you know, we may go to war against Iran in the fall. And furthermore, we're deeply enmeshed in the Ukraine war. We're trying like crazy to get out, at least Trump is, but he's been unsuccessful. The fact that we're enmeshed in the Middle East and we're enmeshed in Europe means that the last thing we want is a crisis in East Asia. Have you all been noticing that President Trump is going to great lengths to make sure we don't have trouble in East Asia? Because we would be really in the deep kimchi. And the reason is that we have all sorts of military liabilities vis-a-vis China in terms of our force structure here, because we haven't paid enough attention to building up our force structure. Plus, we're pinned down in East Asia, in Europe and in the Middle East. So I think that one can make an argument for the foreseeable future. It's likely that there won't be a major crisis in East Asia, and that is all for the good. So all of this is to say, you Koreans should hope that the United States remains deeply engaged in the Middle East and deeply engaged in Europe so that we don't cause any trouble in East Asia and you live peacefully for the foreseeable future. I, as an American, have a deep-seated interest in greatly reducing our presence in the Middle East, getting out of the Ukraine conflict so we can concentrate on containing China.
That's a great way to end. I'm going to call it optimism, that we are going to have a period of time here in East Asia and in South Korea where we can focus on the problems we've talked about today, about focus on the challenges that APEC is seeking to address to build peace and prosperity in this region. So I want to thank Dr. Mearsheimer, Dr. Niblett very much for their great insights. And please let's thank them with a nice round of applause.
I love that ending. That was a great ending. Really, that's great. I'm gonna take
Thank you very much for the wonderful session. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give our panelists and our moderator another big round of applause. Thank you very much. Photo is important. Thank you very much once again. As discussed, we have moved from a period when globalization seemed inevitable to an era defined by strategic competition. And yet, APEC continues to stand as a bridge, helping us to navigate between the old certainties and the new emerging world order. Thank you very much once again, ladies and gentlemen. And with that, we would like to conclude session 2. The next session, APEC 3, New Odyssey, Map and Rules in a Great Transition, will begin at 4 p.m. For session preparation, we kindly ask everyone to exit the hall and re-enter by scanning your QR code. Thank you very much for your cooperation. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, welcome to session 3. We have now come to the final session of APEC Gyeongbuk Knowledge Forum. This dialogue, organized in commemoration of the APEC Summit slated for the end of October, will focus on cooperation for the shared prosperity of the Asia-Pacific region. Immediately following this session, there will be a book signing event with our 2 distinguished scholars in the hallway in front of Dynasty A. We do look forward to your fantastic and enthusiastic participation. Thank you very much. Now, the final session is entitled APEC 3, New Odyssey, Map and Rules in a Great Transition. And at this time, we're very pleased to have Professor Na-kyung Lee from the University of Seoul as the moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, please greet her with a big round of applause. Thank you very much. And for our panel discussion, it is my great honor to introduce Professor Jared Diamond, best-selling author of Guns, Germs, and Steel, and Professor Emeritus at UCLA. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Let's give a big round of applause. Thank you very much. And last but not least, please allow me to introduce our last distinguished panel speaker, Professor James Robinson, 2024 Nobel Prize Laureate in Economics and Professor at the University of Chicago. Ladies and gentlemen, please greet him with a big round of applause as well.
Okay, let us start this final session. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Na-kyung Lee. I'm a professor of political science, international relations at Seoul National University, and I'm really honored to be moderating this session. So as you all know, this year, World Knowledge Forum is co-hosting 3 sessions with Gyeongsangbuk-do Provincial Government as part of the lead-up to the APEC meeting in Gyeongju this October. So this roundtable is the final session of the APEC session of the day, and I already have a feeling that this will be great. So today, we're standing at a turning point with global power shifting, the climate crisis intensifying, and AI transforming every aspect of life. So our session takes up this fundamental question of how do we address these challenges? So to tackle these issues, we have great scholars of the century. So we're honored to welcome 2 of the most renowned scholars whose work have really shaped global debates on why some nations fail while others succeed. So let me first introduce Professor Jared Diamond, who's a professor of geography and physiology at UCLA. He's a Pulitzer-winning author of Guns, Germs, and Steel, and many other best-selling books translated in many languages. And here, Professor James Robinson, who's a university professor at Chicago and was awarded the 2024 Nobel Prize in Economics in Science on Research on Institution and Prosperity. So we'll explore 5 topics throughout this discussion: AI, climate, geopolitics, the role of different actors. We'll skip role of different actors if we're running out of time, and Korea's experience. And we will have little bit of time to address 2 questions or 1 or 2 questions from the audience. So let's dive into these questions. So to start off, let's turn to the questions related to AI. So the recent development, which is advent of AI, is shaping our society everywhere. So what is your view on how AI is shaping our society? On one hand, it's creating opportunities for growth and problem solving, but on the other hand, it is creating problems and creating new challenges. What makes differences as to whether society will benefit or suffer from this new technological development, and how should we address this going forward? So we'll first hear from Professor Diamond, and we'll go to Professor Lawrenson, and if disagreement arises, I'll reconcile, and if there needs to be a clarification, I'll ask for a clarification. Thank you very much.
All of you decades younger than I know about the benefits of AI. My sons, my 38-year-old sons, will explain to you that I can only tell you about the disadvantages of AI, and I will mention three that I've seen, serious ones that I've seen in recent years. First, in teaching UCLA undergraduates, within the last couple of years, our students have turned in essays overwhelmingly written by AI. American students were already losing the ability to write, and now their ability to write has crashed even further because they are not writing. Problem number one. Problem number two, in the most recent course that I taught at UCLA in the spring, we asked each student, each of 16 students, to give a short oral presentation of 5 minutes. And I was shocked to see that of the 16 students, 15 read. They were incapable of ad-libbing a presentation. They read a presentation that had obviously been written by AI. So students have lost the ability to talk spontaneously, but that means that they've lost the ability to persuade people in the business world, and they've also losing the ability to persuade partners to marry them and to conduct a fruitful relationship. And then finally, the week before last, both Nature magazine and Science magazine, the major weeklies, had articles on the explosion of fraudulent science articles produced by AI. Each year now, there are about 3,000 new journals turning out tens of thousands of articles, and a large fraction, maybe more than half those articles, are fake articles generated by AI, in some fields more than others, especially in cancer research, biomedicine, and molecular biology. Jim, can you say something good about AI, please?
Well, yes. I mean, for me, leaving aside the sort of science fiction of AGI and all of that, if you think about it as a technological revolution, and you think of it in terms of past technological revolutions, you sort of say two things. Think about the Industrial Revolution or the spread or diffusion of computers. On the one hand, they raise productivity, not as much as you'd expect. Computers never raised productivity as much as you'd expect. If you looked at the Industrial Revolution, the invention of the factory system, mechanization of production, steam power in the late 18th, early 19th century, and you looked at the numbers on productivity growth, it's sort of there, but it's modest. So, it's less than, it's more than its detractors say, but it's less than its kind of, boosters say. So I think, there'll be clear productivity benefits. But as in all of those examples, there's big distributional consequences. So the Industrial Revolution, the factory system, mechanization put skilled workers out of business. In England, they became known as the Luddites, who went around smashing machines because they were unemployed. The spread of computers, we now understand has had a kind of tectonic effect on wages and employment in the United States. Computers were very complementary with college-educated and skilled workers. So I think AI is also going to have big distributional effects. What's interesting is it's not clear how they're going to go at the moment, because AI might also displace a lot of college-educated and skilled workers. So computers were somehow very complementary. So in those previous revolutions, it was sort of clear who was going to suffer distributionally. I don't think it's actually quite clear at the moment who's going to suffer distributionally from the spread of AI, and that's a puzzle at the moment.
Okay, so I'm going to ask a follow-up question to that. So, Professor Diamond, do you have something to add to that related to sort of this distributional consequences of AI, or how we might be able to address that? Or is there any way to address it, given that AI benefits certain people or a certain society, whereas it actually creates disadvantage for a certain society? Is there any way out, or do we have to just embrace it?
I have nothing to add to Jim's clear forecast of problems whose solution is not clear yet.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's different ways of addressing it, and I think, but a lot of the instruments you have depend on the sort of model of capitalism that you have. In some sense, the diffusion of computers in the United States has caused so many social and political problems because of the model of capitalism we have in the United States, which says, you can't provide social insurance to help these people. In Sweden, you have a very different model of capitalism, which gives you a lot more instruments for helping people adjust to these changes. In the early 19th century, of course, you didn't have redistributive instruments to deal with these problems. You sent out the militia or whatever, or there were but I do think a lot of it has to do with the legitimacy of the institutional structure. Also, you can cope with a lot of distributional change if people think what's happening is happening in a kind of proper and legitimate way.
I could just add to that now. Thinking back on the negative consequences that I mentioned, there are ways to address those negative consequences, and we're already trying to do them at the university, but we haven't figured out how best to do it. For example, for students turning in papers that are generated by machines rather than themselves, one thing that we're doing in exams is that students have to handwrite exams in blue books. We don't permit students to do computer-generated exams because their computers may be connected to AI. That's one thing. Similarly, in terms of students giving talks, we can require students to give spontaneous talks. We can say you may not give the talk with notes. I recall that when I was in high school, each of us in the class was required to give a spontaneous talk on a subject that was announced 30 seconds before he gave the talk. And I remember a classmate of mine was asked to give a talk on it is better to eat peas with a spoon than with a knife. And my poor classmate was tongue-struck. He couldn't think of anything useful to say, but nevertheless he learned his lesson. He went on to become a communications officer at General Motors, where he was very successful. So I think that frightening experience shaped him up.
Thank you for a very fruitful discussion, but I think no AI can be as good enough to write bestseller books as you guys have written, right? So I think we still have hope for human talent. So let's move on to the second topic that we prepared, which is climate change. So when societies face climate change, as you two have both kind of described in your books, some adapt and some even innovate while others collapse, right? So what explains these differences, and what kind of lesson can we gain from these experiences in really thinking about how to address climate change crisis in today's world?
I'll have two things to say about that. And the first short thing is that my field work is on the island of New Guinea in tropical jungle. Things are always going wrong there. And so I've learned to adopt an attitude that I call constructive paranoia. I'm paranoid, I think of everything that could go wrong, but a constructive paranoia, I try to benefit from it. There are nations that practice constructive paranoia. A prime example is Finland, the Scandinavian country of Finland. Finland was attacked by Russia on November 30, 1939. The Finns preserved their independence at the cost of 100,000 dead Finns. And the lesson that the Finns learned is that since the Second World War, every month the government of Finland has a constructive paranoia meeting. That's to say, each month they have a group of experts, one of them is a friend of mine, whose job it is to think of what might go wrong this month with the banking system, this month with the electric system, this month with the product system. So they think of everything that could go wrong, and they prepare for it. The result was that when COVID broke out, the Finns had thought about a pandemic 2 years previously, and the Finns had stored something like 300,000 face masks. So the Finns, because they're prepared for everything that could go wrong, were prepared for COVID.
Yeah, I'm not sure I've studied climate crisis, but I think, what Professor Diamond is saying, I completely agree with, which is there's lots of different sorts of crisis, and probably your ability to respond to one is very similar to your ability to respond to another. So I think, if you think, I always like the example of South Korea and South Vietnam. So what's the difference between South Korea and South Vietnam? Well, they both faced these sort of existential threats from North Korea and North Vietnam, and South Korea failed miserably. South Vietnam failed miserably, and South Korea succeeded. Why was that? Well, I think because South Korea was able to develop a kind of collective project. It was able to develop a sort of cohesion and a sense that there was a goal that they were all kind of working towards, and they were able to kind of get behind that goal, and South Vietnam was never able to do that. They disagreed, they could, so I think there was cleavages within the society with regard to the North, and and the whole legitimacy of the government of the South. So I think a lot of it has to do with that ability to work cohesively and sort of define priorities. The way Professor Diamond is talking about. It seems to me to be successful in this climate space. The biggest problem is it's just not visceral enough. The problem, it's too nebulous, the climate problem. So, if I was working in that space, it seems it's, part of this is a sort of communications issue. Like, how do we make that so visceral to people, that they're going to pay attention to it, and that you can actually build a sort of collective project around that. So I think that's to do with, why was South Korea able to do that? To do with the legitimacy of the institutions, to do with the, the social capital in the society.
Yeah, so Professor Diamond, do you have something to add to that?
I would like to add one more thing, that the issue of climate change is an example of a crisis, and nations face all sorts of crises, such as the crisis, Jim, that you just mentioned. My wife is a clinical psychologist, and there's a branch of clinical psychology called crisis therapy, which consists not of helping people with long-term problems by seeing them 3 times a week for years, but is for dealing with someone who has a sudden crisis, someone whose marriage broke up, someone who was just given a diagnosis of cancer, someone whose mother just died. It's something that makes them doubt that their way of coping with life has worked at all. And it turns out that in crisis therapy, you have about 6 weeks to either to figure out a new way of dealing with life problems, or you revert to your old, non-adaptive way. Well, in crisis therapy, there are lessons for how to get through a personal crisis that also apply to national crises. The first lesson is you have to acknowledge that there's a crisis. The United States, for a long time, did not acknowledge that we had a crisis. Secondly, you have to acknowledge that you have responsibility for dealing with the crisis. You can't blame those other bad people. The United States had an unfortunate tendency to blame Canada and Mexico and not recognize the bad things that it was doing. In a crisis, a personal crisis, as in a national crisis, you have to distinguish between the things about you or your country that are working perfectly well and the things that need changing. In a crisis, personal as well as national, you can learn from other people. You can get help from other people. You can look at other nations that have solved the crisis. And for example, Japan, after the Meiji Restoration, Japan is a wonderful example of a country that learned by looking at how Germany was doing it and how England was doing it and the United States, and figuring out what worked best for the Japanese. So in short, for dealing with crises like climate crises, national crises, there's a lot that we can learn. There's a lot that I've learned by looking at how individuals deal with personal crises.
Professor Robinson, do you have anything to add to that, or? Okay, so it seems like both scholars agree that it's important to set priorities straight, and we need to acknowledge that it's a problem and really drive lessons to tackle the issues. But one problem is that, like in certain countries, environmental problem is not recognized or acknowledged as like a existential crisis. So where do we start in thinking about acknowledging that climate crisis is a real issue that we have to deal with, or we have to prepare for? Because it seems like from your discussion, preparing for environmental crisis starts from acknowledging the problem.
I mean, I think in the United States, you have to somehow depoliticize it. If you look at survey data on whether or not people think there is a climate crisis, then there's an enormous bifurcation between, different political sides, Democrats, Republicans. But that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. This is just a scientific question. It's just a matter of evidence. It shouldn't make any difference what your politics is. So somehow this got wrapped up, in this political polarization in the United States. So the first thing that needs to be done is to somehow disentangle this issue. This is not about left or right or Republican. This is about the society, collectively. And I think that somehow has to get across. I mean, a wonderful historical example is from the Netherlands. That the Netherlands, most of the Netherlands is actually below sea level. And the Netherlands, when it emerged, in the early modern period, was able to build all these collective polders, these dams, these earthworks to kind of make the country secure from flooding. And one thing which is interesting about that, relevant to the discussion here, is everybody worked together. Why is that? Well, because if there was a flood, everyone drowns. Elites drowned, rich drowned, non-elites, poor people, they all drown. Doesn't matter. You can't save yourself from a flood. So somehow it was an issue which really was existential for everyone, and they had to work together. And you'd think, well, the climate crisis looks like the same sort of problem. No one can insulate themselves from that. So I think if one could communicate that and in a way that would depoliticize it, that would go a long way to, having some objective notion of what the evidence is.
I would just add to that the best teacher is not us communicating, but the best teacher is what climate itself is doing to us. For example, last summer, the American city of Phoenix, the temperature never dropped below 45 degrees centigrade for a month in Phoenix. 45 degrees centigrade at 6 a.m. at dawn. And in the daylight, the temperature was 50 degrees centigrade for a month nonstop. That meant that people walking on the sidewalk in thin shoes, their feet got burnt on the sidewalk. That was a lesson to people in Phoenix. We in Los Angeles, you undoubtedly know about the fires in Los Angeles. We should have been forewarned. We had 2 straight wet years that made large-scale growth of green vegetation. Green vegetation doesn't burn, but there was a lot of it. And then in the 3rd year, we had a very dry year. So all that green vegetation then became dry and was subject to burning. And then on January 7th, there were strong winds, so fires spread in Los Angeles. You undoubtedly saw the pictures. Large parts of LA look like Hamburg and Hiroshima at the end of the Second World War. 20,000 houses were burned. I have dozens and dozens of friends who lost everything in the fires. Well, that taught LA a lesson, and I hope it will teach other Americans a lesson, but if it doesn't, then Americans are going to learn the way that Americans learned at Phoenix. Their feet are going to burn when they step on the sidewalk, and eventually they will have to connect it to burning fossil fuels, despite our current government.
So is it going to be late if we learn that climate change is an existential crisis by experience? If we only learn if we experience earthquakes or floods or drought, is that going to be too late, or is there something that we could do, even at that time?
I think that depends on your model of climate change. If you have a very non-linear model, which actually many climate scientists do, then it may well be too late. Yeah.
Okay, so I think the conclusion or the lesson from this interaction or the lesson on climate change is that we need to be all aware and perceive the climate change as a problem and really work towards the goal of addressing it as soon as possible. So let's move on to the next important topic, which is changing climate politics and landscape. So it seems like now, in today's shifting global order, a lot is happening. A lot of uncertainty, power struggles, changing alliances, and competition over resources. And amidst these uncertainties, some countries are growing stronger, whereas some countries are growing weaker or declining. So, how can we explain these differences? And in a world where power seems to dominate, can weak or middle power countries still protect their interest and find some room to maneuver in this sense?
There are strong countries and there are weak countries. There is a lot that can be learned from history. The greatest historian was the Greek historian Thucydides, 2,400 years ago. His history of the Peloponnesian War is still worth reading because humans are humans, and Thucydides is gripping. One of the most terrifying passages in Thucydides' Peloponnesian War concerns a strong state and a weak state. It's called the Melian Dialogue. The dialogue on the Greek island of Melos, a small island that was threatened by the powerful Athenian Empire. The citizens of Melos were not prepared for the demands made by Athens. The Athenians visited Melos and said, "We want you to do such and such and cooperate with the Athenian Empire." The citizens of Melos said, "That will make you look badly in the eyes of humanity." Well, that was not an argument to take with the Athenians. And the terrifying end of the Melian dialogue is that the Melians refused to accept the Athenian demands, and the dialogue ends by Thucydides saying, "And so the Athenians conquered Melos, and they killed every man, and they sold all the women and children into slavery." That's an extreme example of what can happen with a strong country and a weak country. When the weak country has not anticipated and dealt with a strong country. I mentioned the example of Finland. Finland learned from its experience with Russia. Finland with a population then of 3 million, Russia with a population of 150 million. After World War II, the Finns made a point that every year the president of Finland visited the president of Russia, and constantly every month government bureaucrats at every level talked with the corresponding Russian bureaucrats. The result was that the Finns convinced the Russians that the Russians had no surprises to fear from Finland, which the Russians had felt at the outset of World War II. The Finns went to a big effort to anticipate the concerns of the Russians. Today, with the tragic war between the Ukraine and Russia, I don't know what the Ukraine did or failed to do before the war with Russia, but I have to wonder whether there was anything that the Ukrainians could have done to anticipate. For example, whether they could have made clear that they were not going to join NATO, that they would get much more harm from joining NATO than if they permitted talk about joining NATO, whether the Ukrainians, by talking constantly with the Russians, as the Finns did, whether the Ukrainians could have staved off their fate.
Yeah, I'm old enough to have grown up during the Cold War, So I'm always a little surprised when people think suddenly there's this world where power relations are important. And, I remember, the Russians invading Afghanistan and everybody manipulating every African country, the war in Angola. Actually, I remember the United States invading Afghanistan and Iraq pretty recently. And so my view is that power relations have always sort of driven the world. And, in some sense, we've lived through this very bizarre period, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Professor Fukuyama's End of History, sort of imagining that we've sort of gone through this phase transition and everything is going to be different. And I never believed that for a second. And now we're all sort of waking up, it seems to me, and remembering, dusting off our copy of Thucydides and Tolstoy. You were mentioning, Professor Diamond was mentioning Tolstoy earlier, and kind of re-engaging with this. So I think we're back to that sort of reality. And, I think if you look back at that reality, there's always been power politics. Could be the Soviet Union, could be NATO, United States, could be, go back, could be, my own country, Britain, that used to have this global empire. We were endlessly invading countries and annexing them and fighting wars. And so that, I think that's been the sort of the history of the world. And I think, within that history, embedded within that history, if you look at it, there are all sorts of opportunities for small countries to flourish. South Korea, I was mentioning earlier, flourished, despite being sandwiched between North Korea and communist China, and, Taiwan flourished despite the ever-present threat of invasion, from mainland China. And I think you see around the world many countries flourished in niches, you could say, in this system, maybe niches in this system. But I think South Korea wasn't really in a niche even. It was right in the forefront of this, and still it hatched this remarkable, successful kind of project. So obviously, terrible things can happen, in this world driven by power politics. Terrible things could happen. Terrible things have happened. But I think that doesn't stop countries flourishing despite, these such difficult circumstances.
Jim, you've inspired me with another thought. This is You've inspired me with another thought. This is what some small countries have done in the modern world with great success, so that they are important productively, or they're important as examples, far out of proportion to their population. The small countries that I'm thinking of include, of course, Finland, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Israel. You would be surprised to know that I think the Netherlands, that tiny country of 16 million people, is the second largest agricultural producer and exporter in the world. Why? Because the Dutch learned to build towers 100 stories high, and they don't have just one crop on the ground, they have towers, enormously productive. So the Netherlands are a major agricultural producer. Again, Israel, with highly educated citizens, productive and creative, far out of proportion to its numbers. One thing that I would mention is that the countries that are productive out of proportion to their numbers, Israel, the Netherlands, Norway, Iceland, Finland, these are countries where women have complete equality, where women, in fact, play a role out of proportion to their numbers. The country of Iceland, all the presidents of Iceland in recent history have been women. On my visits to Finland, the presidents of Finland have been disproportionately women. I regret to say that there are countries known to you, well known to you. I have Japanese relatives, and I was shocked to learn from a Chinese friend about similar problems with China. In China and Japan, and you can think of other countries, there is not equality of women. That means that China and Japan is a country with a population of 125 million that is behaving like a country with a population of 62.5 million, because they have these highly educated women, but the women do not have anything like equality. In China also, and you can judge yourself for Korea.
I think these were really insightful answers, and really give us something to think about in relations to how to conduct diplomacy, as like a sort of middle power that South Korea is, but also thinking about, women's equality and the role of, and what role that plays in really strengthening nations' capacity. So let's move on to the final question, which is related to where we are right now and where this conference is held, South Korea. So let's have this conversation sort of closer to home and think about Korea's role and how it should perform on global stage. So as you've mentioned, Korea achieved remarkable success despite limited natural resource and despite being surrounded by sort of powerful countries such as China and Russia. So what lessons can we learn from Korea's experience? And which lessons are most relevant for other countries? Like, how can other countries learn from Korea to be, successful or develop into middle power or, I guess, developed country? And that's the first part of the question. And the second part is Korea is holding APEC in October, and so what can Korea do? Like, how can it use its position to shape international cooperation, global dialogue at APEC?
As a visitor, a frequent visitor to Korea, I've been here. This is about my 8th or 10th visit. And I come here because I enjoy the country, I enjoy Koreans, and I admire Korea. What are the things that I admire about Korea? Your population is highly educated. You get value out of your population. Korea has demonstrated again and again in the last 150 years the ability to survive adversity. Just think what Korea has gone through that the United States has not gone through. You've been occupied for, 45 years. Your schools were not taught in your Korean language. Your schools were taught in a completely different language, Japanese. After World War II, Korea was not a highly industrialized country. You began to industrialize so that within decades, Korea rose from a relatively poor country that had come out of occupation to a first world country. Korea has demonstrated patience. You've put up with so much in the last 50 years. One of the predictors of people dealing with crises and of nations dealing with crises is that usually neither people facing a divorce or a death or another crisis, nor nations, when a crisis arrives, usually you don't solve it successfully the first time. You have to try again and again. But a country that doesn't have a track record of success gets discouraged and gives up. Korea does have a track record for, what is it now, 115 years. You've gone through the most awful crises, worse than anything that the United States has gone through. So those are reasons why other countries can look at Korea and can take inspiration from Korea's success. Jim?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I was going to say that a couple of years ago I had dinner in Bogota in Colombia in South America with a bunch of the biggest business tycoons in Colombia. And I'm very critical of the situation in Colombia. If you've read my books, I'm very critical of the situation in Colombia. And they all tried to convince me that, no, Colombia was a great success story. Look at Guatemala, like we could be like Guatemala. And I said, no, you shouldn't compare yourself to Guatemala. You should compare yourself to Korea, because Korea shows what is possible. It shows what is possible in a country if you invest in education, if you just believe in yourself and you just throw everything at transforming the society. So I think it just shows what is possible, and that's just extraordinary to me. If you think about you could replicate the Korean experience in Nigeria, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in the poor countries of the world, in the Philippines, it would be just extraordinary. So I think South Korea should get out there and blow its trumpet, about what happened in this country. It's remarkable, and focus on how you did it and what you did. Maybe the details are not so important. Every country grows in its own way and specializes in different economic activities. I don't think it's about creating a Colombian Hyundai or creating a Colombian Samsung or whatever. But I just think that sense of possibility and kind of setting the bar is very important, actually, for galvanizing kind of projects, developing projects in countries. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that insight. So I have one follow-up question. So I've been talking to my American friends and European friends, and one thing that I hear often is that they're surprised or they're mesmerized by how resilient Korea's democracy is. So since both of you have talked about institution and the role of institution, and then coping with crisis in your books, so how do you view why is it that some institutions are more sort of resilient versus others? Can we get some lessons or some insights from you so that we can shed light on the Korean experience, but also experiences by other countries?
Jim, you go first.
Well, I tend to think that democracy is a bit like agriculture. It was invented independently in different parts of the world it wasn't just invented by the Greeks. It was invented by the Greeks, but it was invented by people independently in the Central Valley of Mexico, in Africa, in East Asia, I think if you look at the kind of deep history of the species, I think what we know about Homo sapiens is that it was almost certainly much more egalitarian than our nearest primate relatives. Something about the emergence of Homo sapiens from chimpanzees created a much more egalitarian type of society. There's no alpha males or silverbacks I tend to think of, democracy as being something which comes naturally, to humans all over the world. But I think, what you see in Korea is that it's been spectacularly successful democracy. It's not that, but sometimes democracy emerges in very challenging contexts, like in Latin America, for example. Democracy emerged in the 1990s, recently, but it emerged in the context of very weak state institutions which couldn't achieve much, very sort of clientelistic type of politics, and then people get disillusioned. But I think what you've seen in Korea is democracy emerged in the late 1980s. Well, you could say there was democracy in the 1950s or whatever, but democracy kind of re-emerged in the late 1980s in the context where state institutions could deliver for people, could achieve things, where politics was much less clientelistic than it was in Latin America. So people see the fruits of democracy and they're willing to sort of fight for it, not just for kind of deep ancestral reasons, but also they understand the benefits that it's brought to this society. I think, my mother used to say, credit where credit's due. And I think, if one looks at, economic policies in this country in the 1960s and 1970s, for example, under President Park, there were successes. There were definite successes. But for me, it's impossible to imagine the kind of explosion of creativity that you have in this country now without that transition to democracy.
Something that I would add goes back to the parallel that I'm always aware of being married to a clinical psychologist. I see a parallel between success of a democracy and success of a marriage. If a young couple who's about to be married, get married, asks me, what do we need for a successful marriage? I will answer, you need 37 things to get right. It's not enough to get right about sex and children and money and religion. There are 33 other things. You got to get all 37 right or your marriage is doomed. But the other thing I would say is that you don't set up a successful marriage and then you coast along happily for the next 50 years. Marriage requires constant work. Things come up. There are new issues. Each person changes. I'm now 88. I married Marie when I was 45 years old. Marie is a different person now from when I met her. I met Marie when she had just turned 30. Marie is now about to turn 77. Marie is a different person. She's gone through a different life. I'm a different person now. So marriage requires constant work, even after 50 years. It's the same way with democracy. The United States founded a democracy in 1776. And yes, there were issues with our democracy. We've constantly struggled on those issues. We broadened the categories of citizens to whom democracy applied. We fought a civil war. In our civil war, more Americans were killed in our civil war than in all other wars put together. The latest studies show that the death toll in our civil war was 800,000. That's far greater than in World War I, plus World War II, plus Vietnam, plus Korea. One would think that from 1776 till now, 2025, the United States has learned how to operate a democracy, and we don't have any problems doing it. We know how to do it. All you have to do is to open the newspaper any day, or to spend 1 hour any day in the United States, or to turn on the television, or to have a conversation with my wife or my children. You know that democracy in the United States is in severe difficulties now. Jim and I were talking about this over breakfast. It's uncertain to me whether the United States will still be a functional democracy in December 2026. What this illustrates is that democracies have to be worked on. You don't just set them up, but they require constant work, just as do marriages.
Thank you for your insights into how we can make democracy work, both in Korea and in the United States. So now we have only a few minutes left. So I think we have time for one question, or maybe we don't, because we have like 3 minutes remaining. Maybe we'll receive like one quick question from the audience, if there is any question. Okay, maybe you at the front.
Somebody's got a microphone, yes.
Okay, we're running out of time, so if you can
Sorry
go
about that. Hi, my name's Andrew. I work for the Quebec government here in Seoul. I'm a research innovation attaché, so I do work related to science, tech, and innovation. And you made a very good points that Korea is, miracle, Han River, all that. Korea is a very tech-heavy economy. It has Samsung, Hyundai, all that. They spend 5% of their GDP per capita on R&D. But as you know, Korea is kind of at a crossroads these days. Korea is very good at semiconductors, secondary batteries, all that. But other countries are kind of taking over, if you know what I mean. Other countries have other systems that may be able to enable them to compete globally better. So I'm just wondering what kind of things Korea should do to be able to kind of compete in this global arena these days in terms of science, tech, and innovation.
That's for me, yes, about innovation. I mean, I think, I think in Korea at the moment there's sort of angst, about falling behind in artificial intelligence and, falling behind in some sorts of domains. And, but the way I look at that, I mean, just think about this country 50 years ago, Korea was behind on every single dimension of technology, absolutely behind on every single dimension of technology. And you didn't just catch up, you overtook everybody else. You had no shipbuilding industry, and 15 years later you had the world's most successful shipbuilding industry. You had no motor car industry, and 15 years later you had one of the world's most successful motor car industry. So I think there's a sort of capacity here and the capability and the entrepreneurial talent to solve that problem. So technology advances in fits and starts, and it's difficult to know. I think AI is kind of advanced so rapidly, it sort of surprised everybody, you know. But I think if you look at that history of technology, my guess would be Korea is going to be able to rise to the challenge.
I would add to that in my childhood, American secretaries of state used to play a thought game. They would mention 3 countries, and the usual 3 countries were Korea, Philippines, and Ghana. And secretaries of state would ask people in the Foreign Office, these 3 countries were all poor, Korea, Philippines, and Ghana. Which of these countries do you think is going to become rich in the next few decades? And the answer was obvious. Korea was going to remain mired in poverty forever. The countries that were going to become rich were Ghana and the Philippines. Why? Because they were tropical, they had the advantage of being in the tropics. What actually happened is that Korea is the one that's ended up rich, and Ghana and the Philippines remain mired in poverty. Part of that is the deep roots of development. Korea developed state government, 1,500 years ago. Korea's had a long history of state government. Korea's had a long history of writing, indigenous writing, the world's best writing. Korea has had a long history of metal tools. The Philippines did not have metal tools. The Philippines did not have indigenous writing. The Philippines did not have state government. Ghana, again, state government, metal tools, and writing came late. So Korea has the advantage of a long history of state development in advance. That history has been mucked up for the past century by bad things that happened to Korea. But Korea does have a long history of development to fall back on.
Thank you. Thank you for your insight. So we're out of time, so we're coming to the end of our session. But before we end our session, let's give a round of applause to Professor Diamond and Professor Robinson. And then thank you very much, all of you, for joining us. And this event will be followed by the book signing by the both amazing scholars. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the insightful session. Now I would like to invite all the panel discussants and the moderator back to your seats. Thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, as this Neo-Odyssey draws to a close, we are reminded that navigating the great transition of our age, AI, climate change, and geopolitics requires not only new maps, but also the wisdom of shared experiences, including Korea's own journey. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we would now like to conclude session 3 as well. And as mentioned earlier, Professor Jared Diamond and Professor James Robinson will be holding a book signing event momentarily in the hallway in front of Dynasty A. We warmly invite you to join this very special event. And with that, this concludes all of today's scheduled sessions. We hope that today's sessions has been a truly fruitful and insightful experience for you as well. And we would like to thank you once again for being here with us until the very end and for your participation. Thank you very much.